Blaine or Evan, give me the lay of the land here. I see one council member.
Yeah, it looks like we have one council member. Or no, two. Councilmember Trayon White was first, and then Councilmember Fruman, but Councilmember Fruman just dropped. Oh no, he's there.
Yes, I have to remember, I have to call people in the order that they arrive. I'll give it a couple of minutes before we start.
Morning, Chairman Mendelson.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Good, very good.
What's
And
in
you?
your what's in your background?
That's a painting my wife did of a sort of a satellite view of Jackson Reed High School.
Ah,
And just so folks know, we are streaming to the YouTube and to our website for now.
which means some of this might be recorded as we're speaking.
There you go.
So I
Well,
will see you in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, but we just did an advertisement for Matt's wife's art, so
So that worked well.
correct. Evan, are the witnesses, and you know, I did not pull up the witness list. What is the witness order?
Here, let me give it to you.
IG first, right?
I think that's correct.
See, you don't have it either.
I have an electric. So yes, Inspector General Lucas, Wayne McConnell from McConnell Jones, Glenn Lee, and then the city administrator.
Okay. 4 witnesses. I think we'll probably do 2 10-minute rounds unless somebody talks me into 1 10-minute, 1 5-minute.
Normally, you're the only one who ends up staying after the first round.
Don't say that too loudly or other council members will get that idea of staying.
Hey, more questions, the merrier.
Okay. Well, it wouldn't be like me to start the hearing too quickly. I have a text from Brooke Pinto. She's trying to get on. She said we haven't got a link.
I will resend it to her.
You'll resend it to her email.
Correct.
All right, I'm going to begin this hearing. I'm going to call this hearing to order. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. Today is Thursday, February 2nd, 2023. The time is 11:10 in the morning. This hearing is being conducted virtually. It is available to the public over the Zoom internet conference platform, and I believe it's also being broadcast live on Channel 13. It is being recorded on the council's website, which is www.dccouncil.gov. The subject of this hearing is the annual financial comprehensive report. I think I misstated that. The annual comprehensive financial report, fondly known as the ACFR, used to be known by a different acronym that we didn't know was not appropriate, so it's now called the ACFR. The annual comprehensive financial report is due by February 1st of every year, and I am trying to find my talking points here. I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then I will turn to colleagues who will have 3 minutes each if they wish to make opening statements. The witness order today is to hear first from the Inspector General, Dan Lucas, because it's under his responsibility that the ACFR is prepared. Then we will hear from Wayne McConnell, who is representing the auditor, McConnell Jones, who did the audit. Then we will hear from our Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, and then we will hear from Kevin Donahue, the city administrator. Following the 4 presentations, council members will have questions. Today's hearing is a yearly affair whereby the council is officially presented the results of the district's annual comprehensive financial report. This is for the financial year that concluded September 30th, 2022. Following statements by the Inspector General, who's responsible for the audit, the Chief Financial Officer, who's responsible for managing the finances that are being audited, and the City Administrator, who is responsible for budgeting and spending the finances that are being managed and audited. There will be at least one 10-minute round for each council member to ask questions. The ACFR shows that we had a $12.3 billion of general fund revenues and $10.7 billion of general fund expenditures in the fiscal year 2022. The difference was excess that was added to our general fund balance, and at the end of the fiscal year, the general fund balance was $4.9 billion. I emphasize all of the $4.9 billion fund balance is restricted or committed for our federally and locally required mandated reserves, debt service reserves, future budgets, and special funds. This $4.9 billion fund balance is not extra money available for spending. Rather, these funds are either, and I'm giving a little more detail here, restricted, such as $469.5 million for bond escrows required by the bondholders to support our $13.7 billion debt. Committed, some of these funds are committed, such as the $1.5 billion being reserved for future budgets that was appropriated last year, flows through the financial plan. A combination of the two, such as the $1.7 billion in federally and locally mandated reserve funds, or the $849 million tied to special funds, such as DEMPED's Economic Development Special Account, the Department of the Energy and Environment's Stormwater Permit Review Fund, or the DC Housing Authority's Rehabilitation and Maintenance Fund. Those are just some of the examples of the $849 million tied to special funds. In fiscal year 2022, Local fund revenues were $834.7 million higher than projected, and local fund expenditures were $401.2 million less than budgeted, leading to a budgetary surplus of $439.6 million. I know that math doesn't seem to add up, but there's what I'll call a waterfall of the excess revenues and underspending. And after that waterfall required by law, there's $439.6 million. By law, surpluses, the $439.6 million are automatically split 50% to the Housing Production Trust Fund and 50% to the pay-as-you-go capital fund for infrastructure needs. This money is available for new programs only if we redirect it. That is, to redirect it away from the Housing Production Trust Fund or our capital infrastructure needs. This is the 26th year that the district has received an unqualified audit opinion. I want to commend the Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, and his predecessor, Fitzroy Lee. I also commend City Administrator Kevin Donahue and their teams for the clean audit. However, I'm disappointed that the auditors were unable to verify the accuracy of Events DC's financial statements. And for the first time since 2008, our audit identified material weaknesses. More will be said about this in the course of this hearing. I also appreciate that a management letter with recommendations for improving the effectiveness of internal controls was issued at the same time as the ACFR's release. I will note that the management letter had recommendations or has recommendations for correcting deficiencies in controls for regular procurement, emergency procurement, P-card disbursements, receipts and acceptance, and procurement documentation. In closing, I want to thank our Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Controller Kimberly Williams, Inspector General Daniel Lucas, all of their staffs, and our auditors, McConnell and Jones, for their work on this year's ACFR. With that, I will turn to colleagues in the order in which they arrived. I have Trayon White first. Councilmember White.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm excited to hear where we are as a district government. Since I've been in office, we've had surpluses and access resources, at least for the last 6 years. I guess my focus now is as we take in all this information and my staff and I just going through the annual comprehensive financial report, which is 258-page document. Just trying to figure out how we can use that to move the district along. It's a lengthy document. We have not went through the entire document at all yet. I want to thank Glenn Lee and the team, and even the legal team that's been helping us get this information out. I'm in a list capacity today to figure out how we can make DC more equitable, especially for those who don't feel a part of the economic growth in Washington, DC, and economic inclusion. So I want to thank you, Chairman, for hosting this hearing. I look forward to dialoguing and listening mostly to where we are and what we need to do to stay financially strong, even in the conversation of us talking about or watching the national news of recession maybe on the. So thank you, Chairman. I look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember White. Next, we'll hear from Matt Fruman. The clock is saying 5 minutes. It's 3 minutes for opening statements. Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'll use less than 3. Very excited to hear the testimony today and learn more about the financial condition of the district. I'm heartened to see another year of surpluses with money that can flow into the Housing Production Trust Fund and PayGo Capital. May not be the topic for today, but the question that looms out there is how long will these years of solid financial performance continue, and what kinds of concerns do we have going forward? But grateful for the team for putting this report together. Grateful for the great management of our resources, and hopeful for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you so much, Chairman Mendelson, and thank you for getting me the link. I want to also add my thanks to Inspector General Daniel Lucas, CFO Glenn Lee, City Administrator Kevin Donahue, and all of your teams and to Mr. Wayne McConnell and the audit teams at McConnell and Jones, Regis and Associates, and the WERS group. I know that this audit and report is a huge undertaking every year, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your time and expertise to ensure the continued financial health of the district. DC is facing a changing economic and social landscape, and we have to be creative in how not only we adapt, but also thrive in that landscape. We're experiencing growing inequality in our city and a hollowing out of our middle class, where too many families are priced out of opportunity. While we work to solve our immediate needs of DC, we also have a responsibility to maintain the district's long-term strategy for remaining solvent and continuing to grow our economy. One of the key revenue streams that we use to pay for so many of the critical programs we offer our residents and businesses comes from our real estate taxes, primarily our commercial property taxes. I am extremely concerned about what the next few years hold for our commercial and office corridors. Many office leases are set to expire, and I hear over and over again that many tenants likely will not renew as they adapt to long-term remote or hybrid work plans. And as leases lapse, some buildings may end up being turned over to banks as owners go underwater. So I look forward to hearing from all of you today about what trends you have been seeing over the past few years and what impact this trend will have on the district's financial outlook. Because when we talk about the need to reimagine our downtown, it's not only for the immediate needs of the neighborhood, which are very important, but it's also for the long-term success of the entire city and our financial outlook. Looking forward to learning more about all this today. I also am curious to learn about some of the district's protection efforts against future cyber attacks, like what affected Events DC that made the audit for that category incomplete. So thank you again to all of you, and Mayor Bowser, Inspector General Lucas, CFO Lee, CA Donahue, and the audit team. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Zachary Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to digging in with colleagues on the fiscal year 2022 annual comprehensive financial report. As has been mentioned, it is striking that in the face of significant headwinds over the last few years, the district's financial outlook is strong. Indeed, once again, our revenue growth has significantly exceeded projections, this time by almost $440 million. I want to use our time to get a detailed sense of resources available to meet district residents' most pressing needs, including housing, food access, and violence prevention. I also want to understand the uneven nature of our economic rebound and probe the risks to various sectors. There's a lot of understandable focus on the recovery of downtown DC and high class A office vacancies. But as we work together to create a healthy community and city even, I want to ensure that the economic prospects of residents who neither work nor live in downtown core are prioritized as well. And as we reform and diversify downtown, I want to make sure that our investments are accompanied by real commitments to equity. As we bring more housing units to downtown, what fair and reasonable asks can we make of developers? And I would just end by saying there's a lot of caution, and I think there's reason for that caution in the years to come. And I call on my colleagues here on the council, as well as the mayor, to think about how we can spend money smarter and reduce redundancies and shrink the size of agencies and redirect that money to neighbors and residents in the district through a people's agenda. And so I will be laser focused today in hearing how we can do just that, where their opportunities may exist, as well as throughout our budget conversation. But again, want to commend the CFO's office and all that who were involved in putting together this annual comprehensive financial report. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Parker. Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to my colleagues. I also want to welcome Inspector General Lucas, Wayne McConnell, CFO, and Lee and his team, and City Administrator Donahue to today's hearing. As was previously mentioned by the chairman, this is the 26th consecutive clean audit of the District of Columbia's finances, which demonstrates sound financial management and accounting practices. And I think we can all take a pride in that. The district retained its high bond rating that allows us to help access the market and issue bonds at very low rates to maximize investments to public works projects, as well as economic development initiatives. The district also added $220 million each to the Housing Production Trust Fund and PAYGO Capital, and our federally and locally mandated reserves are fully funded to provide 60 days of operating costs, totaling $1.67 billion at the end of fiscal year 2022. So I'm pleased with the district's financial health. We still have some ways to go, and as chair of the Committee on Business and Economic Development, I am concerned, to say the least, about the material weakness identified at Events DC. I look forward to working with my colleagues, members of the Committee on Business and Economic Development, as we prepare to have performance oversight of multiple agencies within the committee, but in particular over Events DC, to make sure that we fully recover from that cyber attack and eliminate network and system vulnerabilities. The ACFR also shows that the hospitality and business service sectors still not recovered to pre-pandemic levels as we've seen over the years. Income distribution in the district is so polarized, with most people falling at either high or low income brackets, with not nearly enough in the middle. It's my hope that, and my expectation as well, that we can use this information and work together collaboratively to ensure that the district's financial health better translates into broader economic opportunity and security for the district's residents, its workers, and businesses. This requires intentional, targeted investments across the board, but especially in historically disenfranchised communities, so that all district residents benefit from our shared prosperity. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to today's hearing. I'll probably be popping in and out to take care of some other business, but obviously I look forward to asking some questions and hearing some of the testimony of our witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember McDuffie. Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to Chief Financial Officer Lee, City Administrator Donahue, Inspector General Lucas, and Mr. McConnell. Thank you for joining us today. I think that DC is in a stronger financial position than many of us would have guessed nearly 3 years ago. The ACFR is a testament to the district's strong financial management practices and careful stewardship of public resources, and I think we have a lot to be proud of. I see much to be excited about in this report. Unemployment rates are very low, which is a strong testament to the wealth of opportunities in the district. We also have higher than expected revenues from the hotel and restaurant sectors and its sales tax overall. While tourism has not fully rebounded, I think that this shows that we are on track to get there soon. However, I see in this report signs of impending financial slowdown in certain sectors, and I'll be asking questions around your impressions of what we should expect in regard to commercial property tax income and the ongoing economic stratification and wealth disparities that we have or that we're seeing today. I also want to ask some questions around some of our stronger performing sectors, like the healthcare sector, and ways that we can build on our successes going forward. So thank you to the witnesses for your work on this. And as others have said, for another year of clean audits. I look forward to our conversation today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson. So just because there might be some misunderstanding or unawareness by the public, I want to be clear for the record. The law requires that our books, the city's books, be audited every year and has to be audited by an independent auditor. And best practices are that the auditor will change, the contract will change, I believe it's every 5 years. The audit is not managed by the chief financial officer, even though all of us think that the chief financial officer does anything that touches on money. The audit is actually managed by the Inspector General. So we will hear from Inspector General Dan Lucas first, followed by Wayne McConnell with McConnell Jones, who did the audit. Mr. Lucas, you're on.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the
Good
Committee
morning.
of the Whole. I'm Daniel W. Lucas, Inspector General for the District of Columbia. I am pleased to appear virtually before the committee to discuss the district's fiscal year 22 ACWA audit results. Joining me are staff from the OIG and Wayne McConnell, engagement partner and member of the McConnell and Jones LLP integrated audit team, contracted by the OIG to independently audit the district's financial statements. Before discussing the ACWA audit results, it is essential to mention the hard work culminating in today's hearing. First, the OIG is responsible for entering into a contract with an independent auditor to audit the district's financial statements annually. Per the OIG's contract, the independent auditors are responsible for issuing an audit opinion on the district's overall ACWA, issuing audit opinions for 10 district organizational units, funds, and programs, and reviewing audit opinions issued by 7 third-party auditors hired by their respective district organizational units, funds, and programs. Second, the OIG is responsible for day-to-day ACWA audit contract administration and oversight. A substantial amount of OIG resources is devoted throughout the fiscal year to ensure the district's ACWA audit is delivered on time and comports with applicable standards. One of the OIG's main contract administration tools is the ACWA Audit Oversight Committee. The ACWA Committee meets periodically with the district's independent auditors, the Executive Office of the Mayor, the DC Council, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and other district management officials. The OIG's ACWA Committee ensures the ACWA contract deliverables are within scope, schedule, and budget. The committee also serves as a mechanism to adjudicate any issues impeding a successful ACWA audit. Next, I'd like to discuss the district's fiscal year 22 ACWA audit results. As reported, this year's audit of the district's governmental and business type activities received an unmodified or clean opinion. However, this year, McConnell-Jones issued a disclaimer of opinion on the district's aggregate discretely presented component units. As publicly reported, Events DC was the victim of a cyber attack last calendar year. As Mr. McConnell will later testify, because of this cyber attack, the auditors were unable to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence to provide a basis for an audit opinion on Events DC's financial statements. Correspondingly, the auditors issued a disclaimer of opinion, which is reflected in the district's overall fiscal year 22 ACWA. Once Events DC notifies my office that it is ready to complete the fiscal year 22 financial audit process, we will re-engage with McConnell-Jones. Beyond the financial statement audits, government auditing standards also require the auditors to communicate in writing certain internal control deficiencies identified during the audit. For fiscal year 22, 5 of the reports issued by the OIG present control deficiencies, findings as reported by the independent auditors. Mr. McConnell will be able to discuss these deficiencies in greater detail during his presentation. A list of all fiscal year 22 ACWA reports is included as an attachment to my testimony, and all reports are available on the OIG's website. Before I conclude, I want to focus on the matters that impacted Events DC and its ability to withstand audit scrutiny during fiscal year 22. The risks at Events DC are not unique to the district. As we continue to increase our reliance on information technology to initiate, authorize, record, process, or report financial transactions, the district's IT systems and internal control over financial reporting become more interrelated. Therefore, a robust IT control environment is imperative to identify and mitigate any potential risks that may impact the district's financial system. Later this month, I will communicate with the district agency leaders about this matter and the underlying risks. Further, as the OIG conducts its oversight work during FY23, we will continue to pay particular attention to IT-related controls. In concluding my remarks, I would like to thank the ACWA committee members for their dedication in monitoring the ACWA audit over the last several months. I would like to recognize the leadership of the OIG ACWA Committee Chair, Mr. Fiketi Jindaba, as well as representatives from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer and the Office of the City Administrator for their continuous support during the ACFR audit process. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. McConnell to provide an overview of the fiscal year 22 ACFR audit results.
Mr. McConnell, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Inspector General Lucas. We've not been given.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is Mark Schwartz. Can someone grant me access to present the deck? It is currently disabled.
We just switched it on. You should be able to do it now.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. And thank you, Inspector General Lucas, for that kind introduction. My name is Wayne McConnell, and I'm a partner and a member of the McConnell and Jones fully integrated team that conducted the independent audit of the District of Columbia's annual comprehensive financial report, or ACFR, for the year ended September 30, 2022. Also here with me today is Mark Schwartz, who worked with us on the audit and is the partner in charge of our Washington, D.C. office. My firm, McConnell & Jones, is the independent auditor of record for the ACFR for the year ended September 30, 2022. We would like to thank the chair and council members for allowing our team the opportunity to present our audit results today. This first slide shows the type of audit opinions on the basic financial statements for 2022 and 2021. I'm pleased to report that we have issued an unmodified opinion on all of the district's opinion units, with the exception of the aggregate discretely presented component units, upon which we issued a disclaimer of opinion. The opinion units are defined as the governmental activities, the business type activities, the major funds, and the aggregate discretely presented component units. This shows the type of audit opinions on the aggregate discretely presented component units for 2022 and 2021. Please note that the report for Events DC has not been issued. This slide shows the path forward once the books and records of Events DC are reconstructed and the audit is completed, and the resulting impact on the opinion of the district's financial statements. Events DC believes that it can provide sufficient audit evidence to us as the auditors. But Events DC needs to complete reconstruction and provide the required documentation in order for McConnell & Jones to issue the Events DC audited financial statements. In the absence of any external reporting deadlines, the audit may resume and be completed as soon as the information is available. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board Concept Statement 1, paragraph 66 states, if financial reports are to be useful, they must be issued soon after the reported events to affect decisions. As a result, timely reissuance is key in complying with the standard. If additional support is provided by the management of Events DC, we anticipate that the audit opinion will be revised. The opinion would include an emphasis of the matter paragraph, and the report would be dual dated, as the opinion on the fiscal year 2022 financial statements of the primary government is not anticipated to change. However, the opinion on the fiscal year 2022 financial statements of the aggregate discretely component units is expected to change, subject to the outcome of the audit procedures performed on the reconstructed accounting records. Because there is a possibility of a change in the report on the financial statements of the district, those in charge of the distribution of the ACFR should keep track of the parties that they have released the financial statements to, in order to appropriately document communications with these parties upon release of the opinion. This next slide shows the type of audit opinions on the standalone district entities that McConnell & Jones also audited for 2022 and 2021. You will note we have issued an unmodified opinion on 9 of those entities, but have not issued an opinion on Events DC for fiscal year 2022. This shows the type of audit opinions on the district entities that were audited by third-party audit firms for 2022 and 2021. They have issued unmodified audit opinions for all 7 of these entities. We identified material weaknesses in internal control over financial reporting at Events DC, deficiencies in internal control over procurements for the district, and deficiencies over information technology controls at UDC. We identified no instances of fraud, and none have been brought to our attention that are material to the financial statements. We propose no audit adjustments or past adjustments, which we consider to be material to the financial statements. And we received full cooperation from district management during our audit of the district. These are the material weaknesses identified as a result of the cyber attack at Events DC. These findings provide the summary results of our testing of internal control and compliance that have been classified as control deficiencies. There were no instances of non-compliance that were noted. There are 3 findings that are pertaining to UDC in the area of IT, and the remaining 11 findings pertain to weaknesses noted in the areas of procurement and disbursements at various agencies. This slide 10 is a summary of the prior year findings and management recommendations. Please note that 4 of the 10 prior year findings have been implemented. And this slide presents a summary of the status of the findings of the DC Retirement Board. This prior year finding has been remediated. On these 2 slides, slide 12 and 13, is a more detailed presentation of the status of the open prior year findings and recommendations listed on slide 10. Under professional standards, the auditor is required to communicate certain matters associated with the execution of the audit to those charged with governance. The items presented in slides 15, 16, 17, and 18 fulfill our requirements to communicate these matters to those charged with governance. We want to make you aware of some new and proposed accounting standards that would be applicable to the district in the coming fiscal years. GASB statements 91, 93, and 96 are not anticipated to have a significant impact on the district's financial statements for fiscal year 2023 and beyond. However, the reporting model project will have the most significant effect on the presentation of the district's financial statements in the future. This project is being developed to determine what should be included in the basic financial statements and to ensure consistency in presentation by state and local governments. We appreciate the guidance and support to the McConnell & Jones audit team by the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and all district personnel involved in the fiscal year 2022 audit. This concludes our prepared remarks, and we'll be happy to answer questions about the independent audit of the district.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell, for your testimony as well as your work on this. We'll now hear from the Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Glenn Lee, Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. I appear before you today to report and discuss the fiscal year 22 annual comprehensive financial report, as the chairman described, commonly known as the ACFR. With me today is Kimberly Williams, our Deputy CFO for the Office of Financial Operations and Systems, as well as others from our team who will assist in answering questions. I am pleased to report that the district's financial position remains strong. The positive results reflected in the fiscal year 2022 ACFR could not have occurred without our continued collective financial discipline and sound financial management practices. I would like to recognize the hard work of the agency program and agency financial staff who contributed to the successful management and accounting of the district's financial resources during fiscal year 2022. I also want to thank the city administrator and the inspector general for working with my office to produce this report. We will continue to collaborate with the city administrator and agency program staff to ensure that management letter findings are effectively remediated. My presentation today will cover the highlights of the district's fiscal year 2022 results, after which I would be happy to respond to any questions that you have. So I see that our presentation is up, and we'll go ahead and get started here. On our first slide, I just want to reiterate that we have a clean audit opinion, our 26th consecutive. I concur with the portrayal of this as something to be proud of. And I know we all are here in the OCFO as well as our agency partners. So very pleased with this. Our federally and locally mandated reserves for both emergencies as well as capital and working liquidity are full. And the ratings for the general obligation bonds and income tax bonds remain strong. Each have AAA ratings from at least one provider, and then a notch below that from the other two. So very strong view of our financials from the debt industry. All right, next slide. First thing I'd like to do is look at the revenues for the general fund. And this is the broader general fund. So it includes the dedicated resources that we collect and account for in the general fund. Far and away, our largest revenue are the collective income and business taxes that we have. Income taxes for businesses and personal income tax. In fiscal year 2022, of the 12.3 billion that we collected overall or used overall, 4.1 billion came from the income taxes. The next most important, as you can see on this graph, is the property taxes, which generate not quite $3 billion to the global general fund, or about 24%. In the other category, the resources that are captured in that include non-taxes, like licenses and fees and permits and so forth, fines and forfeitures, as well as our ARPA resources, which is the federal subsidies to operate our COVID responses. And in addition, a couple of fund balance transfers that we can talk about later. So that's what is included in the other source, which is altogether a large portion of our revenue stream. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now we'll look at the spending side of the global general revenue. Our largest piece of our general spending, of course, is in public education system, where we spent nearly $2.9 billion in fiscal year 2022, which is a little over 25% of our total spending. Following that is our human support services at $2.2 billion, or 20%. And then our next largest is financing and other. The vast majority of that 1.6 billion roughly, or is our debt service to the roughly $12 billion in outstanding debt that we have. All right, next slide, please. All right. Now I'd like to talk about our revenue performance relative to 2021. As you can see here, we had substantial growth, about 14% over fiscal year 2021 revenues. One of the largest performers, or the largest, was income taxes, and it grew about 17%. This is a large portion of this growth has to do with overall economic phenomena of asset price appreciation. And we'll talk about that in a little more thoroughly later. But basically, $250 million of the growth year over year came from non-wage, non-salary income tax payments, that obligations from non-wage, non-salary incomes from households. It's normally a smaller part of our of the income tax, but in this particular case, it performed exceedingly well. And this, of course, has a corollary with the stock market performance in this time period. So we received a lot of revenue, a lot of growth from that area. In addition, sales taxes were up 39%. General sales were up about 17%, but we also saw a very strong rebound in the restaurant industry and hotel industry. Of course, the rate of growth was tremendous, but it came off of a terrible year because of the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic on those public-facing activities. So nonetheless, it led to overall a strong growth in our sales tax. We had a large growth as well in deed taxes. Deed taxes are collected when different kinds of transfer of ownership occurs with properties, real properties. Our assessment is that there were a lot of unusually high number of high-value commercial property transactions during the fiscal year that led to what we think will be a one-time spike in this revenue stream, and rather than an ongoing trend of relatively more sales than we'd seen in the past. Non-tax revenue grew as well. Both fines and forfeitures grew. Investment income on our cash reserves grew, and our unclaimed property program grew as well. And then finally, as is noted by several of you, real estate property taxes struggled. In fact, year-over-year basis, we had about a 10%, roughly 9% reduction in revenue from commercial property assessments and therefore collections. And overall about a 7 or 8% decline in this revenue stream. So that's something, per your comments, something that we're very concerned about and watching very closely. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is describe to you the components of the surplus that we received in the general fund. I think Chairman Mendelson laid this out pretty clearly, but what we'd like to go through is this in a little bit more detail. So there's two components of surplus. First, you can overperform in your revenue relative to your forecasts and what you built your appropriations on. And the second is you can spend less than your appropriations. We had both phenomena. So let's talk about the revenue side. Now, this is the smaller general fund, so local resources, if you will. We had basically, relative to the last set of appropriations for fiscal year 2022, the revisions to the budget, we had 3 additional revenue forecasts where we had some increases in the forecast, one in June, September, and December, for a cumulative increase of $834 million. The majority, again, is income tax, both business and individual or household income tax. We had a large gain in non-tax revenue, and finally, a substantial increase in sales and excise tax relative to our expectations. I think a couple of phenomena that are important is that it's really difficult to estimate the implications or the timing of the recovery out of the pandemic-based recession. And that's especially true in the sales tax area, where there was more economic activity, more transactions happening. I think in addition, because of longstanding policy of the Federal Reserve to have relatively low interest rates that drove asset price appreciation. And as I described before, that had a really large impact on income taxes, and one that was basically not forecasted, not only to the degree it increased by us, but by many other jurisdictions. For example, in Virginia, their income tax revenues exceeded their initial forecast by over 20%, and individual income taxes in Maryland increased by about 15% relative to their original forecasts. So I'm saying industry-wide that asset appreciation was difficult to forecast, and many of us under forecasted that phenomenon and what it meant to our revenue streams. So let's move on to the next slide. Again, the asset appreciation was a real phenomena that we had that was challenging us. The surge in commercial building sales, somewhat due to loan refinancing, as well as other situations, led to what again we think is a windfall in deed taxes, and will not necessarily is not a trend. So it's a one-time gain in relative to 2022. In addition, with the really robust labor market, we saw impacts both on income tax, on the wage and salary portion of income tax, as well as more spending, more sales tax revenue, therefore, because of higher spending. And it again reflects a relatively robust employment market where unemployment rates are relatively low, and nominal wages are growing somewhat due to inflation. And as a result, from a nominal point of view, we have strong growth in that area. In addition, as I mentioned before, there was a resurgence in hotel and restaurant activity. That was very difficult to estimate when that would occur. There was no doubt we were going to get there. We got there well, although both industries will tell you they've still not gotten back to pre-pandemic levels. So we're trying to evaluate that path as we move forward with our next forecasts. And then finally, the higher inflation did in fact affect our revenues. Not only it increased relatively our what we think are wage-based income taxes, some sales taxes, but it also affected property insurance premiums, and therefore the taxes collected from those premiums. Next slide, please. So I'll review this briefly. This is a look by activity cluster in the district of general fund spending and the underspending relative to the final revised budget for those areas. So it totaled 401 million, which was 3.8%. Next slide, please. All right. So what does that mean in terms of surplus? From a local general fund point of view, our surplus was $1.5 billion. Actions were taken last year through the budget process to use $337 million in the fiscal year 2023 financial plan, leaving roughly $1.2 billion effective surplus that could be used. And the two components again are $835 million in additional revenues than we anticipated originally, and underspending of $400 million. There's some other net adjustments primarily around the school events that the $38 million. Okay, next slide, please. Right, now let's talk about our overall reserve for the general fund. There are several components of our reserves. And as we described earlier, our federally mandated reserves and locally mandated reserves that we have for unanticipated spending or cash flow purposes are fully funded. And they constitute 495 million and 1.2 roughly billion, respectively. In addition, because of the nature of our current debt service load, our reserves need to be increased relative to fiscal year 2021. And so a portion of our debt service, a portion of overall reserves is increased to the 470 million figure you see there. In addition, through a variety of budget actions in the past, 1.46 billion is set aside for future budgets, consistent again with budget development in the past and the current financial plan. There are several dozens of reserves set aside for particular programs, and they total $847 million. And then finally, what's left over by code is allocated equally to the Housing Production Trust Fund and the PAYCO Capital Projects Fund, if you will, that the chairman mentioned earlier. And those total together $440 million. Next slide, please. Again, I want to emphasize that because of our financial status, our situation, we fully funded all components of our reserves, both the two that are federally mandated as well as those that the district has established for its own operation. And the effect is the total amount of these reserves is equal to 60 days worth of operations, which is about $1.68 billion. So we've met that criteria. There's many reasons why you have these reserves, but certainly an important one is to demonstrate to the financial markets that we're a very good credit because we have appropriate reserves to protect ourselves from difficult times, as initially through the pandemic is a good example of that. So we're fully funded in these emergency and contingency reserves, as well as our cash flow reserve. Next slide, please. Finally, from my perspective, another bit of good news is that our pension system is fully funded at just under 100%. However, our OPEB trust fund is not fully funded. It's at 90%. And the reason it's not fully funded is its trust fund had fairly significant losses in the capital markets in fiscal year 2022, frankly, as did the retirement board, but the retirement board was overfunded before, above 100%, so it had room to absorb this, whereas OPEBs, that's not the case. However, under various policies, the district will make up for this gap through a variety of mechanisms that actuaries will help us determine. So to be clear, there's absolutely, with this drop in percent fundage, it is in no way a threat to the benefits that are provided here, but it's not an optimum level, and there are mechanisms that will be deployed to get us back to 100%.
If I can interrupt, this is a loss in value, not a loss from transactions.
That is true, sir. Yes, it's a loss in the investment trust set aside to fund this over time. And as I said, the retirement system had the similar kinds of trust losses, but they're still 100% funded. All right, next slide, please. To conclude, again, we have a clean, unmodified opinion. I'd like to note that we are fully committed to support the district and in particular Events DC to take the steps necessary to reconstruct their transactions for fiscal year 2022 that were affected by the cyber event, so that the Inspector General and the auditors can look at their financial outcomes from 2020 and hopefully verify and restate their opinion so it's unmodified from disclaim. So my team is fully committed to support Angie Gates and her team to make this happen. So we will work at full pace here. There'll be some disclosure requirements we have with the outstanding debt, but those are not material relative to the safety of paying our responsibilities. So I'm very comfortable with that. Nonetheless, we will put enormous energy into helping resolve this issue for fiscal year 2022. We are fully funded of our reserves, and there are surpluses that have been allocated, $220 million each to the PAYCO Capital Infrastructure Program, as well as the Housing Production Trust Fund. Okay, I believe that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. We will now hear from Kevin Donahue, the City Administrator, and then we'll have questions.
Good morning, everyone. I'll also be sharing my screen. Chairman Mendelson, members and staff of the Committee on the Whole, I'm Kevin Donahue, and I have the privilege of serving as the City Administrator. I will be providing short testimony today, and then I'm joined here by our Budget Director, Jenny Reed, and Director Reed and I will be answering questions that you have for us. On behalf of Mayor Muriel Bowser, I am pleased to deliver testimony on the fiscal year 2022 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, better known as the ACFR. I want to start by saying a few words on the district's solid financial position. The Bowser administration's commitment to responsible fiscal stewardship of our taxpayer dollars and the economic challenges our city may face in the very near future. FY2022 marked a significant turnaround for DC, one that we continue to build upon as we work towards DC's comeback. Through this work, we make Washington, D.C. a place for successful businesses, flourishing neighborhoods, thriving residents. And under the mayor's leadership, the district has been infusing our economy with the unprecedented amount of federal aid that's been a significant catalyst for the city's recovery from the COVID pandemic. Just a few examples is that we added 3,000 new residents in FY22, reversing a population decline that started in the pandemic, added 14,000 hospitality and retail jobs, representing a comeback in that industry, and reduced unemployment rate to 4.6%, down from 6.5% a year ago, and increased the number of hotel room days sold. All these are elements of an important economic rebound that we're seeing. Despite this progress, however, the next few years will be pivotal for the district. While we have benefited from a historic influx of federal funds, it was a once-in-a-generation event, and that money in large part will not be available in FY24. At the same time, some of the key drivers of our robust growth have flipped. So over the next 2 years, our investments must be strategic and prudent. We cannot likely maintain the level of growth in new government spending that came as a result of this unprecedented federal stimulus. All of us, the executive and the council, will need to make tough choices in the upcoming budget and need to respond to an economy whose future may be more uncertain. We know we have high levels of inflation right now and a tight labor market. But I do want to be very clear, the amount of government spending that we are accustomed to over the past few years is likely not sustainable because so much of it over the past 2 or 3 years was aided by federal stimulus. Now I'll begin my formal presentation with just that as some brief opening comments. The CFO has already touched upon some of the things that you see on this slide, so I won't repeat them. I will reiterate a couple of things. So in addition to this being the city's 26th consecutive clean audit, this is the 8th consecutive year that under the Bowser administration, no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies were identified for the district government. This is an important achievement. It would not have been possible without the focus and diligence of the Mayor's Budget Office, the OCFO, the OIG, and the Council's Budget Office. I want to highlight as well I want to highlight that our reserve levels have 60 days of cash on hand for the fourth consecutive fiscal year. Our physician and retiree benefits funds remain robust and our bond ratings remain unchanged. When I testified last year on the FY21 ACFR, our major focus is on investing federal ARPA funds to accelerate our recovery in areas like learning acceleration and reducing gun violence. In FY23, we continue to focus on our investments in these areas, both through ARPA funds and local funds. As we look to FY24, we'll be focused on implementing, among other things, the mayor's recently released comeback plan, which does provide a roadmap for equitable recovery and growth. The mayor's comeback plan sets 6 goals for 2028 focused on unlocking the full potential of our residents, our neighborhoods, and our businesses. And our city's agencies are currently working on developing and implementing strategies around these goals. The district has also been hard at work getting the $2.3 billion in flexible ARPA relief funds out to our residents and businesses to support our comeback. As you can see from the chart, since FY21, we've spent nearly $1.1 billion, which is just under 50% of the total ARPA funds we received. We were also about halfway point in the total time we have allowed to spend ARPA funds, so we're very much on track in ARPA spending, and we're confident that all funds will be expended by deadline. I want to note it's quite possible in a new Congress there might be clawback legislation, so spending ARPA funds is very, very important. We do appreciate Council including a provision in the FY22 Budget Support Act that allows the city to carry forward any unspent funds and use them for the same purpose in FY23. Of the $313 million in FY22 ARPA carryover, the mayor has approved 127 of that carryover to be used for the same purpose. This means, unlike last year, we are confident we'll be able to continue programs without interruption, without relying on limited contingency cash, such as providing affordable housing acquisition and preservation, food access, and high-impact tutoring. This will also have been helpful in allowing us to be able to spend these vital and needed federal resources. As part of the mayor's FY24 budget, it will provide a full list of all approved carryover amounts to the council, broken out by agency and program, so you can see what was used under this new provision. On this slide, you see a breakdown of underspending, which is highlighted in the prior presentation, which shows, though, that about 40% of the underspending should actually be considered carryover rather than true underspend. For example, just 2 sources of underspend, workforce investment account and home and community-based services, constitute about 40% of the total underspend. When you take those 2 sources out of the equation, FY22 local underspend was approximately 2.7%, which is comparable to last year's underspend rate at 2.6%. And we're happy to go into more details about underspending in the Q&A. On the next slide, you see a series of bar charts and a line graph. And as you heard from the CFO, while the district's economy is improving, it is not yet back on the same growth trajectory as we saw pre-pandemic. So revenue growth will be slower in the out years, driven largely by slower than average population growth, uncertainty around a recession, declining federal employment, declining stock market, and weakened commercial property markets. As I noted at the start of my presentation, while we have benefited from an influx of federal funds, the wave of funding is receding. And as we develop the next budget, it is critical to recognize that we need to look at the long-term sustainability of our programs that we stood up with federal funds and really look at ones that were inherently more of one-time spending that was specific to our comeback and the recovery from COVID. As we look ahead to our comeback, we know there will be challenges ahead that will impact the city. The federal government's long-term use of telework will continue to have a negative impact on downtown businesses and commercial real estate market. And as the mayor has repeatedly said, federal workers need to return to regular in-person work. Our downtown businesses, the dry cleaners, the sandwich stores, the restaurants, the bars, continue to feel the pain of missing these downtown crowds. We also know Vermont is improving service levels are very encouraging, but ridership remains down from pre-pandemic, particularly on the rail. And this reduced ridership will have a direct impact on transit revenues and foot traffic downtown. Moreover, WMATA received significant federal stimulus funds to remain relatively whole, and these funds will expire over the course of our financial plan and will lead to difficult decisions for the whole region about how to sustain service levels, and fares. And finally, we're seeing the political impact of a new Congress just starting, and this polarization and any radical policy changes may have an effect on the city, our residents, and our financial stability. So as we work to put together the FY24 budget, which will be delivered to the council next month, we must all focus on ensuring an equitable comeback for the city. This means our investments must focus on how to make DC a place for successful businesses and neighborhoods and people. I know that despite some of the challenges that lay ahead, we have the strong financial tools and practices to get us there. Now, before I end my presentation, I want to thank my budget team, led by the Mayor's Budget Director, Jenny Reed, who joins me today, the CFO and his staff, the OIG, the auditor, and the numerous DC agencies that all played a role in making sure we had a clean audit. It has taken a tremendous amount of hard work to get us to where we are today, and I commend everyone for the success. And I want to finally end, because we're in a budget formulation season, for an invitation to council members and any residents watching or listening at home, that as we develop the mayor's next budget, we want your input. And we'll have 3 budget engagement forums coming up next week. Next Wednesday, February 8th, the mayor will host her annual senior budget engagement forum at 12 noon. This will be held virtually, and we'll be advertising a call-in number as well. Next week, we'll also have 2 budget engagement forums that will, for the first time in a few years, be in person. Thursday, February 9th at 6 p.m. at Jacksonville High School, and Saturday, February 11th at 11 a.m. at Eastern High School. We encourage residents to sign up at budget.dc.gov. These forums, which I've been to all these forums over the course of 8 years, I can attest with firsthand knowledge they're incredibly important in helping shape budget priorities as we make the necessary trade-offs to balance the budget. Chairman Mendelson, thank you for the opportunity for me to present and discuss the annual comprehensive financial report. I appreciate the leadership and support you and other council members have provided so we can collectively sustain and expand the district's success. I'm now here with Director Reed to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue, and thank you all of the witnesses. We will have at least one round, 10-minute round for questions from council members, and probably 2 rounds. I'm going to start. The ACFR identified the district's first material weakness in years at Events DC. This material weakness was precipitated by a cyber attack that uncovered several weak financial controls and failed systems. Events DC must complete reconstruction of its financial records for the auditor to be able to render an opinion. What is the status of Events DC's reconstruction effort, and when do you anticipate Events DC will be able to furnish sufficient documentation for McConnell Jones to complete its audit?
We are in the process of hiring the consulting firm that will manage the reconstruction process. I expect that work will start very, very shortly. And until a firm is selected and they develop their work plan, it's difficult to know whether or not we're talking about a 4-week effort or an 8-week effort. It depends on information that we can provide from external sources to them for their reconstruction effort. But we're happy to provide updates for that process if that would be helpful. But right now we're focused on bringing someone on board, and I expect that to be very, very shortly.
So when I was briefed earlier this week, there was talk about a February 15th deadline. There's also a March 31st date. My understanding is that the March 31st date is not a end of the world date, but it sounds like February 15th will not be met. Is there still hope that March 31st will be met?
The discussion at your earlier briefing had to do with some debt reporting requirements that we have for all of our outstanding debt, including that of Events DC. It is very clear from our bond counsel that this particular situation with Events DC needs to be reported to our bondholders, which we will. and the status of going through the reconstruction process and then having our books audited again. We'll do that in detail. Those are our responsibilities, certainly immediately, as well as on the 31st. I believe the February 15th deadline you were provided, and I can't speak for McConnell Jones or Inspector Lucas, but I believe they had to do with their assessment of the time they needed in order to finish their assessment of the reconstructed data by March 31. And I think at the core, the March 31 is not a deadline that is material to our stakeholders with Events DC, and that we have several very viable ways to describe to the market the financial situation of Events DC. We will do that. And from our perspective, we really want to get this right and want McConnell and Jones to feel very comfortable with the reconstruction effort, and that at some level is more important than meeting a very quick time horizon.
I'm under time, so I'm going to move to my next question related. What are the potential consequences of the finding of the material weakness? Will any of the bonds issued by the Convention Authority be impacted? Can we expect our cost of borrowing to increase?
Not for the district in general. Will we expect any change in our access to the bond market? We've done some research on other jurisdictions that have had this kind of event occurred. Our assessment is that if it's not a recurring problem, which we certainly are working hard to make sure it is not, there's not a change in market status for jurisdictions that have gone through this. There's always exceptions, but in the general case that we have here, we're concluding from our research that that is not a major concern.
The auditor expressed concerns about cyber safety with regard to other agencies like UDC. What is being done to ensure that all of the component agencies now get their act together with regard to cybersecurity? That may be for the city administrator.
Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. That's an excellent question. Earlier this year, I issued a CA's order that required 3 elements of all DC agencies, including those that are more independent. One is to move towards multi-factor authentication, which is a vital part of trying to protect our systems. A second element is removing end-of-life systems, so we ensure that the systems that we are using are up to date with the latest cyber protections. And finally, that we report all vulnerabilities to Octo so they can investigate and mitigate them. I view this order as a start, and you pointed to an issue that's pretty vital, which is trying to make sure we have consistency in our cyber approach across both the DC agencies, but also across the multiple levels of independence that sometimes exist within our cyber response. So we have redundancy and consistency of training and standards by which we hold the employees and the systems accountable.
So will these weaknesses be resolved soon enough that they don't show up in the next ACFR?
Oh, I mean, I will refer the weaknesses across all of government. In the ACFR, I know it focuses particularly on compliance with a risk management framework. That's something that we were working on as a city to be consistent with NIST standards. The one that I think is the most notable is the extent to which the work that's being done in Events DC, because it was identified clearly because of the hack that occurred there, is remediated to the extent possible over the next few months.
I'm going to keep moving. My next question is going to take longer than the time I have, so we'll have to split it between rounds. The ACFR Management Recommendations Letter notes that DCPS lacks effective controls over its emergency procurements. The letter specifically notes that, quote, failure to notify City Council is a violation of DC code, and it prevents the council from exercising its oversight responsibilities as required by law, unquote. Unfortunately, the council has dealt with multiple procurement issues related to DCPS over the last few years. Last December, the council received, meaning a month ago, the council received 2 retroactive contract packages for DCPS food services that had begun a half a year earlier on July 1st. Alarmingly, one of these agreements authorized a unilateral letter contract to pay up to $4 million to Sodexo Magic before the contract would be definitized and approved by the council. And in fact, over $6 million was paid out across the 2 contracts before the contracts were even submitted to the council, and the council had an opportunity to review and approve them. Just like the finding issued in the fiscal year 22 ACFR, this is a violation of district law, but it pales in comparison to the fact that for the last 2 fiscal years, I repeat, last 2 fiscal years, DCPS did not submit any food service contract to the council, despite the fact that perhaps $40 million was paid out each year without council approval, another clear and egregious violation of district law. DCPS's procurement controls are clearly not working. The agency has regularly broken the law in recent years, and the result is a complete lack of public accountability. How and why did this happen? Who wants to go first? Mr. Lee?
Since your office brought this to our attention at the executive level, we've been researching this particular event. We're still researching. Clearly, this outcome, as you described, is unacceptable, and we are working as diligently to understand the steps that were not taken to ensure that the contracts are in compliance to district code. So we'll work on this very hard until we have good ideas on not only what happened, but how to correct this if indeed these are the outcomes that have occurred.
Mr. Donahue, so millions of dollars have been paid out on multi-million-dollar contracts without council approval. How and why did this happen?
It's something that I'm also looking at very closely to understand for each case, whether there are unique circumstances or a pattern that has to be addressed more systemically. I believe you're holding a hearing on this or a roundtable next week. And leading up to that, there'll be a significant amount of research so that there's a clear answer provided to you at the time of that hearing.
This is pretty egregious, but I'm out of time, so I will turn to my colleagues. Councilmember Trayon White. Councilmember White. I will come back to you in a second. Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm not sure I'll use all of my 10 minutes, but a few questions. I am curious to hear more about the underspending. There was an indication, and I think there was a slide in one of the presentations on this subject that the public education space was one of the places where there was significant underspending. But I wonder if someone can call up that slide and give some kind of a sense of where specifically in those sectors we saw significant underspending.
Why don't I start with this answer, and then Director Reed will go into some more specific detail that I think you're asking for. So generally, our underspending, as I noted in my testimony, what looked higher than it typically is for a couple of purposes. The one that I highlighted most notably is that some amount of the underspending is in fact carryover. So it's not spending that necessarily had to be done during that fiscal year, but either because of ARPA or Medicaid or funding our CBAs, we carried the money forward and will be spending it this year. When you remove that, you do have underspending that's pretty consistent with prior year levels. Now, what I will note, and I think this is sort of something that is a high priority, I know for every city agency, is monitoring the number of vacancies that we have in city agencies. Some amount, significant amount, often relates to underspending for positions that were difficult to fill were unable to be filled during the course of that year. And that can differ. Each agency can have a very different experience for the number of open positions that they had a hard time filling. And that typically represents the traditional underspend. And I'll have Director Regis go into some more detail, particularly about the education space.
Thank you, City Administrator. So the overall spending, while the dollar amount does look pretty high, it's about 2% of the approved budget. We would normally expect underspending anywhere from 1 to 1.5% on any given year, just because of the district balanced budget requirements. There are two key drivers in the education space that are relating to that large number. The first is an OSSI that has underspending of about $21.4 million. 19.6 million of that 21.4 are actually for non-lapsing funds. And the largest driver of that is the newly established pay equity fund for childcare providers. That's about 17.4 million. There's a couple things that are relating to that. So one is just the time it's took to stand up the program. It's brand new, didn't get launched till halfway through the year. They're also looking at some ways to more efficiently distribute the funds, perhaps by going directly to early child care centers rather than to individuals themselves. Lastly, we're working on revising the cost estimates so that we can better understand what will be needed going forward. The second largest driver of underspending in the public education system was DC Public Schools. And while the dollar amount is large at $22 million, it equates to roughly 2% of their overall budget. The underspending is in a couple big areas. The first is in a food services contract, underspending of about $12 million. This is related to when the budget was formulated last year, we were expecting planning on higher enrollment as well as more continued operations. If you remember 2022, in the beginning of the fiscal year, the first 4 or 5 months of reopening schools, we did have several instances of COVID waves and there was a lot of disruption. The second is in the security contract, about $5 million. This is more of a technical change that really relates to moving the contract from a calendar year contract to a fiscal year contract. And then we had some underspending as well in tech support and specialized instruction for students. In specialized instruction for students, it's really driven by what the IEPs or the individualized education plans determine for students. So we have to budget a certain amount, but it's really driven by that. So those are the two large amounts driving the underspending. There's smaller amounts in other agencies that we can provide more detail on.
Well, I have to say that was a very specific answer to the question. So I guess you must have assumed that that one would be coming from someplace. So thank you very much for that. There's a reference in the balance sheets to the Housing Production Trust Fund having a balance of, I guess, $403 million today. I think that's on, I've lost where the page was, but is that money spoken for? Is that money in committed to existing projects, or is that the balance that's out there that can be committed to future projects as of this time?
Thank you for that question, council member. So the vast majority of that balance is spoken for. So we do have, that's the balance at the end of 2022. We have an additional infusion of funds in 2023. We currently have about $590 million worth of project in the pipeline, meaning they've been awarded in 23 or they're being slated for underwriting. This is all based off our 2021 RFP. We'll be issuing a new RFP. So we fully expect demand for that funding to be utilized. The reason there's such a high balance on any given fiscal year with the trust fund is that funds are committed to when they are entered or awarded through the RFP process, but they don't actually expend the funds until the projects close, which is typically 2 to 3 years later.
So that's helpful also, because that number is a mirage. But in terms of how much money is there and how much money is spoken for, you say there were $593 million worth of projects in as of 2020.
540 40 million in the pipeline right now for 2023. So that will consume some of the balance as well as the new funding. Part of the balance too is for projects that have previously been committed to, but the funds haven't yet been expended because the projects haven't closed. So they might have been awarded a year or two before, but they don't actually send the money out the door until the project's closed. So it sits there for some time.
I mean, I actually have been involved in a project where we received an award, and I'm no longer involved, obviously. When that will close, nobody knows. But I guess where it really comes to is how much is there that has yet to be committed, even in the sense of subject to an award as opposed to closing? Do you have a sense of what that number is?
Let us get back to you with that number because part of that's going to depend on what is in the underwriting pipeline for the agency. So we can circle back with that exact number for you.
Okay, I'd appreciate that. One of the things that I thought was striking, and I guess there's been some press about this recently, was the inventories of apartments and the number of apartments that were unoccupied and the number of units that are in the pipeline. It looks like pre-pandemic, it looked like we had in the 50,000 units that were unoccupied, and now it looks like we're in the mid 60s. And what do you make of that in terms of residential demand in the context of a population that has started to grow but isn't growing at the same rate as the rest of the region? When you look at those numbers of unoccupied apartments, does it raise concerns for you in any way? How do you see those figures?
I'll start with what we've reported in the past revenue forecast cycles is the district actually lost residents between 15 and 20,000 since the pandemic. And I'm just speculating that perhaps that is leading to unused inventory in the private sector of apartments. But beyond that, I would have no insight. I don't know if Mr. Donahue or Ms. Reed would have anything to add.
I believe in the ACFR, it does talk about that the number of unoccupied apartments is starting to fall again. We also saw a increase in our population level in 22, which reversed a decline we saw over the past couple of years. So we're looking at that closely, but some of the more recent data trends we've seen have been somewhat positive.
So this is at the end of FY22, and we could be seeing population growth now that would be taking up some of what looks like slack, I think, in the 2022 number.
Yeah, that's what the most recent data trends sort of suggest that's
yes,
certainly what we're looking for.
And just as a share of occupied units, we are almost back to where we were pre-pandemic. So we did have a larger share of unoccupied units as it related to inventory. But when you look at the overall percentages, we're getting closer back to where we were pre-pandemic levels.
Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you all very much for your presentations. Could we pull up the chart? I think it was from your presentation, CFO Lee, about the pie chart making up the different elements of our budget that highlighted the distinction between income taxes and commercial property taxes.
sure. My staff is pulling it up now. So were you asking about the general fund in total?
Yes, I believe it was the general fund chart.
Right
This
there?
one. Yep.
Yeah.
This one. So can you speak about how these ratios have changed over the course of the last 3 years between the income and franchise tax bucket and the property tax bucket?
Well, yes, I would love to provide you a more detailed presentation, perhaps with our revenue forecast. But in general, as I mentioned, in the income tax bucket, we're seeing at least now a slightly larger portion of the income tax is coming in from non-wage, non-salary household income. And in the property taxes, of course, we're seeing a larger increase in the proportion of value that's assessed value that is residential as opposed to commercial. As I mentioned, we've seen nearly a 10% reduction in our assessed value of commercial properties, and hence with a modest increase to relatively strong increase in residential properties, we've seen that ratio shift more in favor of residential properties. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, and as it relates to the property taxes, can you talk in whole numbers of what the commercial property tax revenues were over the course of the last 3 years?
I don't think 3 years right here in my notes, but I'm happy to provide that to you. I only have a couple of years and comparisons of forecasts to actuals, but we're happy to provide that to you.
Okay.
But the trend is the trend is what you're suggesting, and that is certainly on the property tax side, that commercial is becoming relatively less significant relative to residential.
Thank you. And Budget Director Reed, is that something you can speak to about the trend of commercial property tax revenue over the last 3 years?
I don't have specific numbers, but what I would say is that I think if you looked at how income, sales, and property taxes looked pre-pandemic, they all made up about an equal share if you compared one another. And certainly, as the CFO mentioned, we've seen quite a shift towards income tax being the main driver. And we are seeing falling commercial property tax revenues. I think the challenging piece, and this is where the CFO can provide more details, is that impact lags based on when the assessments are given. So even though we may be feeling, or property owners may be experiencing some of the losses now, they don't sometimes show up for a few years. But we will also confirm with the CFO and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. And then, if you don't have the specifics for the last 3 years, that's okay. But what are we seeing this year specifically for commercial property taxes that can educate us on kind of what's to come in the next couple of years?
Well,
and not necessarily as a proportion against other taxes, but just in that category.
Right. So as I said, we had a decline in assessed values between 2021 and 2022 in the commercial space of 10%, or roughly 9%, while residential was increasing. Our team is really busy right now trying to assess what the current assessed value process is yielding in terms of whether there'll be more contraction in commercial value relative to the assessment processes that we have to execute. Certainly anecdotally, we understand that commercial property owners are under a lot of stress. We meet with a couple groups rather routinely to understand at least their anecdotal situation. That helps us get a sense of where the stresses are or positive growth opportunities and what that means around the edges relative to our forecast. But I know this is top of mind, and we are seeing the decline in relative share of property tax, what's collected between commercial relative to the total. So yes, we see that, and we're happy to provide you a multi-year look at this.
Okay, thank you so much. And kind of last question on this category, because I think it's really important as we're talking as a city, sometimes a little bit esoterically about what we see happening. Is there any kind of whole number that you can provide? Let's say it's 9%. Let's say that it continues to drop 9%. What that would mean for the district's budget on a whole in years to come in an expected reduction?
Right. And so we will describe that in detail, that sensitivity during the revenue forecast update at the end of February. And I appreciate the sensitivity of this particular phenomena, and we will be very explicit with that. What are, you know, what the implications are of our forecast if we continue to reduce the estimate of assessed value, if that's what it looks like will happen, and then can discuss what would happen if there's yet more reduction relative to what we're currently forecasting. Off the top of my mind here, I can't do the math for you, but I'm happy to provide you that sensitivity before then. But we'll go into this in detail in our upcoming forecast.
Okay, sounds good. That would be great. Thank you so much. Chairman Mendelson started to get at this, I think, a little bit, but will federal interest rates remaining high affect the district's ability to issue or sell bonds?
All things being equal, higher interest rates mean that we can spend less on capital improvements, and because relatively more that we spend would go to interest expenses for the bonds that we sell that support capital. And of course, all things are never equal. You also are dealing with large changes in production costs for the different assets that we're building. But you are correct. If interest rates remain relatively high to how they've what we've experienced as a district, or the industry at large has experienced around the country in the last several years, with the same amount of resources put into our debt service, you'll have slightly less construction money.
Council member, if I can just add a very short supplement to the CFO's response. As a city, we're bound by law that we have a limit to how much capital we can issue debt for based on revenue. So when the CFO projects a relatively flat revenue forecast over the course of the next 4 years, it does limit the amount of capacity that we can take on. Additionally, inflation is most notable and high in some of the raw materials that go into the products that we put into the capital budget. So the dollars don't buy quite as much as they did, say, 2 years ago. And our ability to expand our capacity of a capital budget will be limited, as you'll see going forward with this budget cycle, by the relatively flat revenues that are forecasted for the city.
Right. Okay, thank you. And Mr. City Administrator, when you were mentioning earlier some of our ARPA dollars, in these last couple seconds of this round, do we have any reason to believe there will be more federal investments coming to the district, or any other kind of backup plans to plan for a change in budget that we've come used to even in the last couple of years?
Yes and no. So I'll end with the more positive comment. So no, the types of dollars that were so flexible that allowed for us to get through COVID and build a recovery, likely ARPA was the last of those. And ARPA still, though, extends our ability to spend, really extends through fiscal year 24. The yes part of your answer in response to your question is, we have yet to see some of the significant impacts of some of the capital federal aid that we got through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So there's a portion of that is by formula. Another portion is competitive. So the benefits of that will still be able to be seen and experienced by the city over the next few years.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Parker.
You, Chairman Mendelson. Mr. Donahue, I wanted to pick up on something the chairman was getting at before his time ran out. And I heard you say you would follow up about this, but millions have been paid out without council approval. Can you just speak more and what potentially led to this?
It's an important question, and one I always try to make sure I'm able to give careful and thoughtful answers. So In my response to the chairman, I pointed to a roundtable or hearing the council's having on this topic, I believe next Friday, that a lot of preparation will go into to make sure you get answers that you need from DCPS. Now, as a city administrator, I've asked for both the specific instances to be explained, as well as any general patterns. So I don't want to speak definitively about what happened with specific contracts with DCPS until I'm able to see the benefit of that research into those patterns. So I just want to leave it at that and make sure we provide the right facts and that DCPS is prepared for that hearing next week.
Okay. The chairman used the word egregious, and I think that's pretty generous. I will move on. Mr. Donahue, we talked about agency underspending, and there are several areas that I wanted to highlight. I know we focused in on the education sector. There are two other areas I would like to better understand. There was about 99 million in healthcare finance underspending, as well as 12.9 million in the housing authority subsidy underspending. Can you speak to the factors that led to both of those areas?
For Director Lee can go into some depth.
Thank you, Council Member, for the question. So as it relates to healthcare finance, there are two big drivers. The largest portion is about $90 million of home and community-based services waiver funding. So approximately 2 years ago, we applied for and received a grant under ARPA that allowed us to get an increased federal Medicaid match for our home and community-based waiver services. The requirements of that award, though, were that the local funds that you generated in savings had to be reinvested into the home and community-based waiver services program. So about 90 million of those funds will fall into a non-lapsing fund that will roll forward into this fiscal year and will continue to be used to make investments in those programs. The remaining funds of about 4 million in healthcare finance, which, believe it or not, is less than like 0.5% of their entire local funds budget, was really due to vacancies and just either delays in hiring or internal promotions that led to other positions being open. For the DC Housing Authority, the underspending was solely in the project sponsor-based local rent supplement program. If you recall, there's sort of two components to local rent supplement: tenant-based, where the voucher goes with the person wherever they go; project sponsor-based, that stays with the unit. Those funds are budgeted, but don't actually get expended until the unit comes online. So some years we have units that take longer to get online and open up. And so the money sits there. And so what happens is that fell to the bottom line. We try to true them up every year to make sure that we're not leaving too much on the table. But with a lot of affordable housing projects, as Councilmember Fruman mentioned earlier, it becomes difficult to know when they're going to close. So that's the reason for their underspend. And the one thing I point out is, unlike in years prior, there is no more repair and maintenance fund for the DC Housing Authorities. That has fallen to the bottom line.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And let me know if it's fair to characterize. So at DC Housing Authority, knowing that there are a large number of vacancies, that subsidy that you're talking about, which accounts for a large portion of the underspending, the vacancies, because we aren't getting people in units at a rate that perhaps we could, contributes to the amount of money that we're leaving on the table. Am I characterizing that in a somewhat reasonable way?
So there's a distinction that for local rent supplement program, that is providing subsidy to private development. I mean, not private, but yeah, so it's not public housing.
Got it. Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Mr. Lee, thank you all. Mr. Lee, I want to turn to you and about the commercial property value projections. Has the OCFO modeled scenarios? And this is kind of getting at, I think, what Councilmember Pinto was asking. And I want to note that the total value of taxable residential and commercial properties remain seemingly at an all-time high. Although I note that commercial properties are in a decline relative to other areas. And so just can you speak to modeling and what confidence do we have in our financial outlook if things remain flat versus various scenarios?
Yeah, our team is, because of the various economic challenges that we see in the future, we are evaluating different kinds of scenarios based on different kinds of recession-like phenomena, or this is a little bit different. This is kind of the post-pandemic adjustment scenario. And we will, during our forecast process and forecast briefing of you, be fairly robust in looking at those scenarios and the implications that they could lead to in our revenues. I know my predecessor worked very hard in the latter part of the teens and of course, as the pandemic started, to create the same kind of scenario building of different economic potential outcomes and the implications on our revenue streams. And we are committed to doing the same here as we inform your budget process moving forward with our revenue forecasts. So, you know, obviously there's huge issues ahead, not only an immediate recession, but also we all know that the post-pandemic reality still hasn't played out. It may not for several years and can lead to different kinds of outcomes to the economy more globally, but also toward employment markets and so forth. In addition, you all and the mayor are considering various policies to stimulate particular outcomes that are worthy of assessment, of course, and should be contemplated. And those may change our just baseline forecasts as well if they come to pass. So we take the responsibility of understanding and then modeling different kinds of economic outcomes and what they mean to our revenue streams. And we'll be communicating that to you.
Okay, I look forward to receiving that. And it just brings me to my last question, which is around population projections. As we are projecting to become more reliant on residential property taxes, presumably, and noting that we are posting population declines, I just wanted to get a sense of the level of confidence we have in our ability to shift the direction that we're headed, and in what ways, if any, can we course correct those projections based on census data? I guess what I'm getting at is we are banking a lot on the hope that we can attract folk to the city, and that we can shift course from commercial property tax to residential property tax, and just what confidence or modeling I have there that is a realistic possibility.
So we're not going to estimate the implications, the potential economic implications of the policies you consider or the mayor provides. Our core responsibility is understand the baseline as if current trends continue. And I have reasonable confidence that we can do that fairly accurately. But to the extent there's success in proposals that the mayor proposes or you all agree to or propose, that's not anything that we can simulate or model right now. And our focus would be entirely more or less, you know, as is policy environment, what do we think are the key drivers of population, and what do those trends look like? And that's the basis of our forecast. And again, that's not a commentary on any particular policy at all or proposal. It's just that's where we come from with our forecasts.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just add just 30 seconds to that response. So one of the mayor's goals in the comeback plan, one of the 6 goals, is to retain current residents and reach a population of 725,000. So we've asked our agents to be very intentional about how they can think about the role they can play in building the population up, which I'll say 2 things about. One is that it is the biggest driver of our revenue forecast each cycle, is in fact what we project about population. And two, it's very much not just about attracting people, but very, very importantly, retaining residents that we have who either have options to leave or are considering it, and understanding what drivers can change the outcome of those decisions. That's a big focus of the plan, is resident retention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Parker. Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to keep my questions fairly brief. I actually have a 1 o'clock that I know I'm going to be late for. But again, I want to thank everybody, all the witnesses for their testimony this afternoon. I want to ask, I'll probably just save my events DC questions for performance oversight. I did have an opportunity to speak with the Inspector General, the CFO, and the auditor prior to today. And so the chairman also asked a number of questions about that. And so I won't go into that at the moment. I will just take another opportunity to express my concern for what we have seen in the material weakness that has resulted from this audit. I do want to talk about downtown, and I know we've had pretty extensive conversations about downtown, but I do think it bears repeating, given that there's still a certain amount of uncertainty that exists with the current economic environment. We're still seeing rising interest rates and challenges associated with that, whether that, we've achieved a recession. And I think about, just prior economic downturns in the District of Columbia and our ability as a city to depend on the presence of the federal government and federal workers and not really having that luxury today, and wanting to get from the city administrator just thoughts about, what that means for our local economy today, but maybe even speak to some things that you've seen in this audit, and also some of the plans you all have in the mayor's economic strategy to try to address some of those challenges of the absence of federal employees downtown and not really knowing when the federal government is going to do something about bringing some of the workers back to the office. So I wanted to just sort of ask you in more of an open-ended fashion to hear your thoughts on what you saw in this audit, what the mayor is looking at in terms of economic strategy, and how we're going to be able to address some of the challenges that we're seeing with the vacancy rates in commercial office, currently the shrinking federal footprint in terms of our office downtown, and the lack of federal workers occupying the existing space that they already have leases for.
I appreciate the question. I actually think it's one of the, underneath the detail of the financial report are some fundamental questions, and you sort of raised a question that highlights that, which is, what is the future of downtown? So I worked in the office of the city administrator in the last economic slowdown that we had in 2008, 2009. And I was part of having to construct those budgets, which saw the city have to cut 10% of our operating budget each year for multiple years. And one thing that had, as bad as that was, allowed us to be resilient was the fact that one of our largest employers, not the largest, federal government, maintained a presence downtown and maintained a pretty consistent employment presence that other cities going through the Great Recession didn't see. They would see their employers really have significant cuts back to employee levels. So it has been vital for our resiliency, and it does make us more vulnerable, as other cities do, of slowdowns, because we won't have that base. So the mayor is very focused on advocating at the highest levels of government the importance for urban areas nationally, DC specifically, of having the federal government set the pace in having employees be in the office at least 3 days a week. Second, we recognize that downtown in DC and other places will transition, but we have to have that transition, which will happen by definition over many years. We have to be able to get to that endpoint. So we have built incentives and tax abatements into the budget that started in this year, FY23, that allow for some private sector incentives to build affordable housing and convert office places. But we also see that the rate at which leases are up for some of the commercial office spaces really are staggered because they're very long-term leases. So it's really essential for the federal government to be able to, who holds many long-term leases, to help us get there. One of the pieces of good news, actually two of them, that I highlighted in my testimony, one related to some of the uptick that we've seen in hospitality, both restaurants and hotels, which are two data points that I pointed out that have rebounded. You visually see this walking around DC this past spring, which for me was the first time since the spring of 2019 that you saw large crowds. So recognizing the importance of tourism, allowing for the fact that our restaurants have been doing better are signs of progress. But ultimately, we do need the federal government to be a partner with us in allowing our downtown to transition. And my final thing that I'll say that I know you know, and I think your question helps highlight that many of the things in our budgets that are vital to the equity of the city come from revenues in which the driver of that revenue is the vitality of our downtown and commercial sector. So it's vital for everyone to be focused on that question.
So let me pick up on just the hospitality piece of this, which you mentioned, and I want to get a sense from, because you look at the numbers, you see where the revenues are with hospitality and restaurants, and you hear that things are recovering. I'm not sure that's what you get when you're on the ground talking to some of the small businesses throughout the city. And so I wanted to see if the CFO, if you could speak to what you are hearing and whether that is consistent with the numbers that you've seen in this audit, particularly given your I think you do pretty routine meetings with folks from the hospitality sector. What are you hearing on the ground from folks who are working in this space, both in terms of sales that they're seeing, revenues that they're generating, their ability to hire workers right now is something that I continue to hear from owners and operators of restaurants and other businesses in the hospitality sector. But what are you hearing on the ground, and is that consistent with what you're seeing in the numbers from this audit?
Well, what we hear is that inflation, especially for restaurants, is a very difficult challenge. While we see the actual sales, if you will, of restaurant activity has increased substantially, it's still, when you adjust for inflation, still below pre-pandemic levels. And so you may pay $1 more for a plate, but overall there's 50 less plates sold. So there's more money in the door, but and the providers are also feeling like they have challenges with the employment market, as many of us do. Certainly my organization does as well. The employment market is very tight, and that is impacting them as well. So that's the two things I'm hearing. Inflation is, you may see our gross numbers are up, but the fact of the matter is, adjusted for inflation, it's not as much as you think, and it's difficult to find workers. And that's something probably most employers can say across the country. And it's certainly true with, here in the district. This has been mentioned a couple of times.
And with the last minute that I have in this round, I want to shift a bit to talk about some of the non-tax revenue, which increased 28% compared to fiscal year 2021, as higher interest rates boosted investment income and unclaimed property collections rose sharply. I want you to take a minute, if you could, to talk about this sharp increase in unclaimed property collections, if you could, Mr. Lee.
I understand that there was some legislation in a program that provided different opportunities for administering these claims that may have some implication on this revenue stream, but I would like to provide additional, more complete assessment of this revenue stream to you at a later date and to the council as a whole.
Well, I want to definitely hold you to that. I think it's going to be important to be able to talk about, sort of what you see specifically, and get as granular as you need to in order to do that. But through the chairman, I would like you to be able to follow up with us about that.
Thank you, Councilmember Duffy.
Thank you, Chairman.
Councilmember Henderson. You are muted.
Sorry, my mouse was not working.
Don't blame the rodents.
Very funny. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd first like to start by recalling something that gave us a little bit of anxiety last year, where the calculations for the FY21 surplus that was presented to the council was overestimated by a significant amount. Mr. Lee, what quality control methods were used this time around to ensure the accuracy of the numbers?
Right, thank you for the question. I know that calculation was problematic last year, and our staff implemented a couple extra steps in double and triple checking this process of evaluating our fund balance and whatnot to avoid the mistakes that were made in prior year. So we'd be happy to explain in detail what those extra steps were, but I know that was an issue that was brought up to me several times during my vetting process, and I am assured that we've taken the extra steps to ensure that the numbers are accurate. So Thank you for pointing that out, though. But yes, that was on our mind since we've arrived, and I'm assured that that error has not occurred.
Okay. I'm going to ask some questions about the Human Support Services Cluster, more for informing folks, because I don't want the public or even some of my colleagues to look at some of the unspent money in that cluster and think like that's an available balance. So ride with me. I noticed that in the Human Support Services Cluster, the local funding underspending is about $126 million. Of that, 99 million is attributed to the Department of Healthcare Finance. Now, is it accurate that much of this underspending is coming from the Medicaid Home and Community-Based Services Fund?
Councilmember Henderson, that is accurate. About $90 million of the underspending in healthcare finance is related to home and community-based services. About 4 million is in local underspending from vacancies, and the remaining is in their dedicated tax and SPR funds, just related to not collecting as much revenue to support expenditures.
Okay, and just for folks' edification, this fund was created in the FY23 Budget Support Act. It's a non-lapsing fund, and I believe that funds weren't even eligible to be deposited until October. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so the funds for the home and community-based waiver services will remain in that non-lapsing fund. And now that the year-end balance is certified, they're available to continue to use for just that program, and can only actually be used for that program and enhanced services.
Okay, great. Do we anticipate GHCF spending down that money this year?
We expect by the end of 2024, I believe. So we expect 2 more years. So you'll probably see another rollover at the end of FY23, but 24 should be the last year.
Okay, great. I just wanted to let folks know that that's not an available swipe and swift. It is being used. So ARPA funds, let's talk a little bit about that. The district received those funds in 2021. They're supposed to be obligated by 2024 and spent down by 2026. Director Reed, can you talk a little bit about, well, actually, whoever wants to take this question, if we are on track to satisfy those requirements by the deadline. I don't anticipate that Congress is going to do any type of extension here. So I just want to make sure that we're not going to leave money on the table.
I'm happy to take that one. We are on track and we'll expend the money that has been given to us.
Okay. I think at one point there was supposed to be a dashboard of some sort. Is that available for us to see, for the public to see?
And it is not available. We do continue to produce reports to the Treasury Department on our spending and how we're investing those dollars. We can certainly make sure that everyone gets copies of those, as those are public documents. And then happy to answer any specific inquiries about the spending and how it's going.
Okay. So the only way for us to be able to, I guess, ascertain what's being spent on what, or what has been already spent, is for us to go through these individual reports that you all are submitting.
So there are the individual reports to Treasury. I will also let the CFO speak as their ability to also produce reports on spending based on fund type.
Thank you. Yes, we have some reports on ARPA spending, and we'd be happy to work with all parties to provide those in manners or channels that would be helpful to you.
Okay. Thank you. Several of my colleagues already asked about commercial real estate. So I'll skip on that front, and sort of talk about another piece of moving forward. I noticed within the report that 5 of the district's top 5 employers are in the healthcare sector. The healthcare sector is second to our city's universities in employing people in the city and in the region. And from these numbers, though, I see an opportunity for us to build out additional infrastructure and generate opportunities to further expand the healthcare sector in terms of healthcare technology and research in the life sciences arena. I'm curious, from a projection standpoint, do you all see these industries as driving our economy for the next decade or so?
We're happy to start that. Oh, CFO Lee, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, from our perspective, it's a strong part of our overall employment base, and what we can do for you is describe how our general forecasting processes of our employment base are influenced by this particular sector. Clearly, the largest is federal employment, so that's our focus, but we're happy to describe that in our upcoming revenue forecast.
Okay. Administrator Donahue, I'm just curious in terms of the administration's approach on this. I think you all had a section in terms of the comeback plan, or apologies if I'm saying the name of the plan incorrectly.
That reference, I was going to highlight that one of the goals, one of the sections of the comeback plan is to increase sort of 35,000 new jobs in high growth target sectors. We specifically talked about the healthcare and tech sectors. Part of our ARPA investments was actually focused on the Golden Triangle bid to try to attract incubator space for companies that focus in this area. I would say more generally, though, we're very focused on making sure we have a healthy and vibrant healthcare sector, because it's so vital both for our residents' health and for the economy. And we work very closely with different parts of that sector to understand where there's government regulations, where there's government requirements that either help and aid their ability to respond to changes or need to be modified so they can properly respond to, say, labor market changes to be able to meet the demand for jobs that they want to fill.
That's great. And I definitely want to build on that. And we could talk more offline in terms of how we can support some of those efforts. In my last bit here, I have a question for Inspector General Lucas, if he's still with us. I see his box, so I'm hoping he's still here. In the demographic statistics chart on page 222 in the report, it noted that there were, even though our unemployment rate is down, there is a much higher number of people who have been applying for and are being denied unemployment than before the pandemic started. For those who aren't aware, it says that there were over 51,000 filers whose applications for unemployment were denied in FY22. And the highest number in the previous years, it was about 10,000. So I'm curious, I imagine that this is sort of having a conversation around fraud. And so I'm curious, Inspector General Lucas, how much the district has lost in terms of Medicaid and unemployment insurance fraud, and how are we controlling for this going forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Councilmember Henderson. I don't have the number for you, but there is a significant amount. We are in the process of doing some work inside of DOES around unemployment insurance and fraud. We hope to be able to publish a report within the next 6 months, but we are looking at it from a programmatic standpoint as well as from a fraud standpoint.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing more about that once that report is complete. I'm glad that's on your radar. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson. Councilmember Allen.
Hey there, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Let me start with, of course, I feel like every time we have an act for hearing, let me go ahead and start with the praise that goes into all the hard work that it takes to pull this together, as well as I think having, on par, just a very strong economic picture and future for the city. And I think what you help us put together every year is the ability for us to think about how we are able to do this in a way that we are able to continue to lead in the way in which the district is accustomed to, and also recognize the economics of where we are to make sure that we are making responsible decisions and approach that way. So I appreciate it. Let me dive right in. I'm going to focus my questions, I think, in this round on our transportation area. And specifically, I'm going to be asking Mr. CFO some questions around some of the funding related to our Vision Zero and Department of Transportation. So in the Budget Support Act for FY22, the council had passed a law that required any revenue collected by automatic traffic enforcement system in excess of $98.8 million to be deposited in the Vision Zero Enhancement Omnibus Amendment Act Implementation Fund. Have you been able to identify how much total revenue was collected from ATE enforcement in FY22 and how much was above that 98.8?
To answer that, I'd like my deputy for revenue assessment to join us, if you don't mind.
Of course.
You can take a second. Fitzroy, can you cut in? Dr. Lee? Well, it looks like we need to get back to you on that particular answer. So it looks like we don't have it at our fingertips. So that's something we should know, and we'll provide you an answer.
Okay, we can follow up, certainly. Do you know if the excess revenue, even though you don't know exactly how much it is, and I believe it's a couple of $1 million, do you know if that excess revenue has been transferred into that fund at this time?
I don't have the answer to that, whether it has been transferred. By the way, I'm Fitzroy Lee, the Deputy CFO and Chief Economist, so just to identify myself. But I don't have that detail, but it's something I can check in for you whether the transfer has actually occurred. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just say, according to the council's budget office, the amount that should be transferred is in the ballpark of about 4.6 million is what came in excess of that 98.8, but I appreciate we can make sure we fine tune exactly what that is. So I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, well, first off, we are going to follow up to find out what that exact dollar amount is and if it has been transferred. A baseline question I have, though, is if the transfer has been made, how is the CFO using that experience now to then recognize recurring funds as part of this transfer as we look towards the FY24 through 27 financial plan?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat that? You said using our experience?
I'm asking, will the CFO recognize this as recurring, recognize this excess in recurring funds as part of the, now that we have this transfer?
Well, I mean, whether or not it's recurring funds is going to depend on, you know, what the revenue forecast shows, because it's, as you phrase it, it's whatever is above and beyond the forecast. And as you know, as we go forward, the forecast could change. So it just depends on our revenue forecast and what that says in relation to the baseline.
But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we have mapped out in law what the dollar amount that should come in, we now have a year's worth of experience that it was roughly $4.6 million above that.
So at any given time,
does that factor into your belief of the projection?
So whenever the legislation is structured like that, where it is above a given baseline, each time we do a forecast, we look at the forecast and look at how the revenue came in with respect to the baseline that you've used. And so if the current financial plan allows it, we would recognize the recurrent revenue. But all I'm saying is that that forecast, whenever it's structured like that, that forecast could change with any given forecast. And the revenue that we've mapped out with the current forecast might not be available, in a future forecast.
Okay.
But at any given time, we're using the forecast.
What that forecast looks like. All right. Well, I guess let me ask one other question related to this. So will the revenue from that source in excess of the 98.8, will that be used as, and what I'm trying to get at, as recurring funds or one-time funds as you build into the budget?
And I can't recall the details of the legislation, but what I will say is that whenever we do the forecast, if it's a recurring excess above the forecast going into the out years, we will recognize it as such. We'll recognize whatever the revenue is, and to the extent it's the 4.6 million or whatever it's above that forecast, we would recognize it for the period of the finance.
Okay. I see the city administrator and deputy city administrator seem to be nodding along on that a little bit. So I just want to make sure I gave you a chance if you wanted to chime in from your perspective on this.
No, we were commenting about sort of the projecting out the amount of revenue from the AT program is it's a fairly big part of our own budget formulation process. That remains sort of in flux until we get past that February date. So we also are looking at things, looking at possible investments and expenses based on sort of what that revenue forecast is.
Okay. And Mr. Administrator, from your perspective, are the funds immediate? So the excess that is now realized, we're going to find out if they have or have not been transferred into the fund. But are the funds immediately available to be used by DDOT upon transfer? Or from your perspective, do you have to have the council separately authorize the use of those funds in an approved budget and financial plan?
Hello, council members. So I believe, and we're going to check in on the legislation because it's relatively new. Typically, when funds like that get deposited, unless there's appropriation authority in the local budget act that allows us to spend them, we have to wait until we submit a new budget and financial plan to have that appropriation authority. So I will double check on that, but that would be the determination of whether or not DDOT could immediately spend them or would have to wait.
Okay. I appreciate that, and I'd be more than happy to work with you as well as CFO and follow up after the hearing, because the fund was created in the budget, so I believe it should have ongoing spending authority, but would like to work with you to make sure we clarify that so that those dollars are available for DDOT's ability to use and focus obviously on making our streets safer. So I appreciate it. just recognize I only have about 2 minutes left. Let me switch to one other topic if I can. One of the things I'm concerned about, and I guess CFO Lee, I'll direct this to you to start with. We have a massive influx of federal funding that's going to be coming in over next year and over the next couple of years. The ACFR and the audit obviously discussed the controls that are in place in our agencies and the CFO's office to allow the district to continue to have clean audits and maintain our high revenue bond rating. And we have a long demonstrated fiscal responsibility here. But I know there's also going to be a significant amount of pressure to use those federal dollars and get them out the door quickly to make sure we're doing it with integrity, but making sure that we're getting the dollars out to the communities and for the projects that we need. I think earlier you heard some frustration from some of my colleagues around DCPS contracting, for example, and doing things retroactively. From your perspective, are there any steps the council should be taking? Are there any other models from other states that you see setting up ways to ensure that these federal dollars are able to get out quickly to meet the need, and also, of course, have the accountability and transparency that we're all going to want to have?
Yeah, I focus on the latter, on accountability and transparency. We have a couple of colleague jurisdictions who are currently under audit from Treasury, from ARPA and CARES Act spending, and it's very rigorous. And while we want to spend these resources as quickly as possible, none of us want to face clawback responsibilities because we've skipped a couple steps. So highly sensitive to the issues that Mr. Mendelson is raising, and certainly as with Mr. Donahue, we're committed to sorting this issue out, but relaxing standards in order to speed up the use of these resources is not a good decision in the long run.
Okay, I know I'm out of time on this round, so this is a topic that Mr. City Administrator and I guess our CFO would love to follow up with you all to work on and think about how we're able to help make sure that you've got the authorization you need to be able to get the dollars out quickly, but at the same time have that accountability and transparency we got to have.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the CFO and your team. Thank you to City Administrator and your team and the IG. Want to cover a few related things very quickly. One we've touched on a bit. I know it's a concern for a lot of us, which is a decrease in commercial property taxes, and obviously what impact that might have. So I went back to look at commercial property taxes in the years prior to COVID. And what I found was that in Class A office space, there's been less than a 3% difference from pre-pandemic to now. For Class B office space, less than a 4% a difference in vacancy rates pre-pandemic to now. And in downtown specifically, went from 15.5% vacancy in 2019 to 16.2 now, which is a difference of less than 1%. So my first question is, and again, this is a problem, but it seems like it's a problem that predated COVID. So for Mr. Lee, do you and your team have a sense of whether COVID significantly exacerbated vacancy rates downtown, or did it sort of continue a trend that maybe we were predicting?
No, I think no downtown were any jurisdiction having the kind of radical decreases in uses of property in the downtown area in their cores, or even beyond that. The complexity is being able to execute our property tax laws and assessment responsibilities so that we pick this up as soon as possible. But as you know, there's lags in our assessment processes relative to current economic activity. And I'd submit that this is a really dynamic moment in commercial property tax economics. And the frontline owners are experiencing realities and seeing realities or expecting downside possibilities that are rapidly developing. So our responsibility is to follow our processes, but also do our best to keep that in mind. So I don't think there's any assessment out there, to answer your question specifically, that would indicate that we were on a downward trajectory prior to the pandemic, anything like we're experiencing now.
Okay, I hear you on that. So,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So there's a lag in the data, and also folks are making different decisions now, and so we are likely to continue to see those vacancy rates increase, maybe significantly, probably leases not renewed and buildings emptying out. Is that right?
That is the assessment we're trying to make right now. And we will have a dynamic, full, complete conversation about that in our upcoming forecasts at the end of February. But you've hit on the issue on the nose, is what will the utilization be of the buildings, and therefore what are the income potential for the owners and operators? And then ultimately, how does that then pass through our assessment process?
Okay.
So those are the steps that we're taking to evaluate the implications here relative to district's revenue.
Can you remind me? I apologize. I think it's in the report, which I still call the CAFR, so I need to get my terminology 3 years in check. What percentage of our revenue comes from commercial property taxes, roughly?
Overall, we in 22 had $1.6 billion in revenue from commercial property taxes on a base of 11.6. And while I'm describing that, one of my staffers is doing the arithmetic for you.
Right.
But
it's substantial.
Yeah.
It's substantial. Yeah, that's my recollection on that. So I've also seen we to our benefit, there's been an increase in individual income taxes, an 18% increase from 2021. Corporate franchise taxes increased 15% from 2021. D taxes increased by 27%, and sales and use taxes are up 36.72%. To what extent, if any, do these increases in tax revenues make up for the shortfall in commercial property tax revenues?
Well, ultimately, they make up a substantial amount of that loss. And in general, our tax revenue for the local source or local general fund portion increased between 21 and 22 by about $1.1 billion. So while we are sustaining reductions in commercial property tax, overall revenues are growing to offset that loss.
Okay.
I'm just giving you a statistic there on local general fund taxes, but you can see that's the point, that we're offsetting that with growth in other revenue areas.
Okay, that's a good thing. I guess what I want to make sure we're drilling down on is there is still not showing up in this report, but really going to have an impact on the district for years to come. The health and strength of our commercial spaces, particularly downtown. That's going to be a huge hit if we don't figure it out. As we figure it out, I do want us to be conscious of the fact that there was significant vacancy pre-pandemic. And so all of our response, I think, can't be how do we recover from the pandemic, because some of this stuff started before the pandemic. But one other thing I just want to touch on may be more appropriate for the city administrator. I am struck, and I know others are struck as well, by the fact that individual income taxes have increased 18% since 2021, but our poverty rate has grown to 16.5%. It grew to 16.5% in 2021, up from 14.8% in 2020. Well above the average in the country. So we are seeing an imbalance in opportunity and income. And what are your thoughts about how we are or will be using our resources to help folks who are clearly being left behind?
Thank you for that question. It is one of the most, I think, fundamental questions on everyone's mind. Some of it's contained within the mayor's comeback plan, which has a pretty strong focus on equity and focus on trying to alleviate some of the imbalance that you highlighted. Part of the investments we've had using ARPA money, particularly those that were really flexible, focused on trying to train DC residents to be able to have the skills needed to be able to access some of those higher paying jobs that we know are in high growth fields. During COVID, we saw pretty sharp drops in participation rates for those programs. Just last week, I got an update from our Director of Employment Services about where we are now, being able to fill those slots. We're much more effective now in seeing the demand and being able to fill slots that we funded for job training. And many of those programs are tied to employers or industries that we've seen pretty sustained high levels of employment after that. So that's just one element in the comeback plan and in what we have in the ARPA budget that reflects the need to be able to focus on alleviating poverty. A second point that I'll just highlight is we also know we need to retain residents, particularly residents that, and the example I give is often of the police cadet program, which is we fill up every slot that we fund, and we can have a police cadet who's a DC high school grad who will make about $35,000 out of high school to be a civilian with an MPD. After about 3 years, they'll enter the force as an officer. And so you can have someone, a DC resident in high school, who may come from a family in poverty, and 5 years out of high school, so after they become an officer for 2 years, they're probably earning $85,000 a year with overtime on top of a salary of probably $62,000 as an officer. We want to make sure we retain that resident so that we keep the residents that we're able to successfully help navigate out of poverty into the middle class.
I appreciate it. Clearly, this is something we're going to have to work very closely on, this imbalance between increasing incomes and increasing poverty is something that we all take seriously. So we'll have to focus on that and the strength of our commercial sector. So I look forward to working with you all on that. Mr. CFO, thank you so much to you and your team. Thank you, Chairman.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember White. There'll be a second round. I'm going to start with some questions. I think we'll try 10 minutes, but I'm hopeful it'll be less than that. I wanted to finish with the question I had asked at the end of my first round with regard to DCPS. And I want to thank both the city administrator and the chief financial officer for acknowledging that this is a problem. This is a financial control issue because money is being paid on the basis of contracts that have not been approved. Can either of you say anything more at this point about what specific actions you are taking to ensure that this will not happen again? Mr. Lee?
Well, from my perspective, we want to understand, I think as Mr. Donahue said, whether or not we have an individual issue or a systemic issue. And when we understand the nature of the issue, then we'll be in position to develop a plan to prevent whatever mistakes or fundamental failures have happened. And so the first step is to understand as detailed as we can what led to these conditions and then address procedures from there to resolve that. And at this moment in time, we're not in a position of being able to describe corrective action until we understand completely what our issue is.
Mr. Donahue?
My thinking actually mirrors what the CFO just said. So the specific instances that you raise are being further researched, so I understand specifically what happened in those individual cases. From that, we look to see whether there are systemic issues in play that require some level of remediation. And I want to make sure I understand all the facts before I give you the sort of definitive answer that I think your question ultimately calls for.
Well, thank you, each of you, for that. But I will note on the issue of whether this is isolated or systemic that The DCPS also received a finding for lack of effective controls over emergency procurement procedures in this audit, in this ACFR. Specifically, the auditor found that the council did not receive timely notification for an emergency COVID contract, a contact tracing contract in the amount of $7.7 million for $7.7 million. Further, the auditor concluded that this was due to, quote, a failure by DCPS management to review and ensure the completeness of the listing prior to submission to City Council, unquote. So you all have known about this for a little bit longer than you've known about the food service contract, since I only raised those last week. What are you doing in response with regard to that finding? Mr. Lee?
We will work with DCPS and the city administrator's office to, as we described, address whatever findings that the auditor has provided us. And I don't know enough to know whether those particular issues are related to what you're discovering or what you're suggesting or have documented for us. And so the issues related to expenditures related to COVID resources were in a potentially different context than what the more routine services you're describing. So let's just understand the facts so we know how to respond.
Mr. Donahue?
This specific finding is one that I want to make sure gets addressed at the hearing that you're having. I will say that as findings were identified over the course of the audit process, there were a number of cases where the Inspector General would raise issues to us to make sure we follow up on almost immediately. They did often relate to emergency procurements, often in the case of for warehousing inventory controls. So we would follow up quite seriously as they would be raised. This one in particular that you raised is one where we're still gathering some of the facts. And I want to make sure those are available to you at the hearing that you're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to shift gears. The federal COVID public health emergency. The federal COVID public health emergency is going to expire on May 11th. I remember the expiration date of the federal public health emergency being an open question during the fiscal year 23 budget formulation. My understanding is that ending the federal public health emergency will affect certain reimbursements and enhanced grants the district receives from the federal government. I have two questions. Do you have a sense yet of the local costs the district will incur once these enhanced federal payments expire? And will the full fiscal impact of the expiration of the federal COVID public health emergency be incorporated into the FY23 supplemental and FY24 budget and financial plan we will be receiving on March 22nd? Who goes first? Mr. Donahue? And do you want me to repeat the two questions?
Chairman, I'm happy to answer those questions, and you don't need to repeat them. So on the first one related to the extent of the public health emergency and expiration, and will we be funding those with local funds? So there's two things on that. One is we need to determine exactly when the FEMA public assistance will end. While they are logically tied, they are not explicitly tied. So once the public health emergency ends, FEMA needs to make its own declaration about when the public assistance program ends. What we're told is we'll get 60 days notice. We're trying to determine what those 60 days will be. We currently get a 90% federal match on all of our eligible expenses, which would obviously go away. So we will need to plan out for FY23 and FY24, what are the services that we're going to continue that we'll need to budget local funds for? We have ramped down a lot of the services that we were providing during the height of the COVID pandemic. So we are spending less than we have in the past. But we'll need to determine what services will continue and then to what extent. So to answer your second question, yes, absolutely. Whatever is needed to be funded through the end of FY23 and FY24 and beyond will be reflected in the budget submission to you all as it has been over the past few years.
So you don't have a sense yet of the local costs, but you're working on that.
Correct.
And you're not sure when the, with the funding, I guess, ends, which is not necessarily 60 days before May 11th, but probably. And so you are intending to include the full fiscal impact in the supplemental and FY24 budget.
That's correct. There's another really important component too that's related to this, but not necessarily tied to public health emergency. And that was in the omnibus bill that the federal government passed at the end of December, which now winds down the enhanced federal Medicaid assistance percentage increase we got. So there's now a new timeline for that we're working through the Department of Healthcare Finance. It also affects eligibility. That will also be reflected in the 23 and 24 budget submissions.
Thank you. I'm going to shift again. So surpluses are a beautiful thing when they happen. As you all know, fiscal policy, government fiscal policy is that one wants to spend the money rather than take taxpayer dollars and bank them. In FY21, revenue exceeded budget by $576 million. At FY22, revenues exceeded budget by $837 million. What can what will the OCFO be doing to more accurately get our revenue estimates closer to budget? Mr. Lee?
I'm sorry. From my perspective, fiscal years 2021 and 22 were profoundly remarkable, really for two reasons. First was we had a global pandemic that had intense effects on the economy in many different sectors and probably in sectors we never thought about. And so trying to estimate revenue streams in that time period was exceptionally difficult. And as I described with the states of Virginia and Maryland, they shared the same kinds of overperformance of revenue, if you will, relative to original forecasts for fiscal year 22, in line roughly with what we did. So I think overall, as that particular event made forecasting profoundly difficult. Second is that, in addition, many of us missed the completely understanding the effect of the low interest rate environment created by the Fed and its implications on assets. And as we saw, especially early in the pandemic, large gains in asset values that led to revenues, both in terms of property tax revenue growth, as well as income tax gains in non-wage, non-salary income, which was very, very robust. We don't feel like we're facing necessarily those kinds of conditions. And if anything, we're walking into a moderate recession, which is we have much more experience dealing with in terms of our assessment. So I just would like to make the point in general that forecasting has been very difficult for state and local government during the pandemic because of its severe disruption of the economy, both estimating how deep the recession could be and how quickly we bounce back out of it.
I'm running out of time, but I'm going to ask this last question. Are there any ACFR deliverables that we should be looking for over the next few weeks?
All right, Chairman Mendelson, the answer is no, with the exception of the work that we're going to be doing in Events DC. You have all the reports except for Events DC financial audit.
Okay, let me turn to colleagues. Councilmember Fruman.
Mr. Chairman, I need to step away for a minute. I'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. My staff will be online.
Councilmember Fruman.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess my first, I have 2 questions, and my first one was going to go to the CFO, so I'll go to my second, and it may be that the chairman was already addressing this. I am trying to get a sense of, there's a lot of talk about that there's federal money, that it's going to go away, and then what kind of hole is it going to leave? And I wonder if there's a place to go to see there's federal capital money, that's one thing. There's federal money that's going to things that are exceptional to the pandemic that one would not expect to continue in the ordinary course in anyways. And then there's federal money that is being used in ways that you would think recurring operating dollars would be used. And is there a map somewhere where one can see how much is being used in terms of operating dollars that one would expect to be recurring that's federal now?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that question, council member. So there is a map, so to speak. I'm not sure it is super easy to follow without some guides, but what you could look at is the financial plan and the growth rates in the financial plan. So ever since the first year that we submitted the budget with these significant ARPA funds under Mayor Bowser's direction, we have put local money in the out years of the financial plan to be able to pay for the recurring costs of some of these programs that we believe we will need to continue once the federal assistance ends. It's about $100 million. It's in a variety of different agencies for different programs. We can also follow up with your team. We'll do this again when we submit the FY24 budget, as this will kind of be the last big year for ARPA funds. So we have thought about that and we have planned for it for a number of years now.
And the scale of that is about $100 million. Is that what you're saying? In all of the agencies?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And then which agencies account for the largest portions of that $100 million, or is it peanut butter spread across agencies?
Well, what I would say is there's 3 big initiatives that we've been focused on continuing. So that would be gun violence prevention, that would be investments in Homer DC, and that would be some of the noteworthy education investments.
And how much do you think are those education investments? I ask because I'm wondering, as I watch for upcoming DCPS budgets, how this fits into that.
So the funding would be more funding that would be in the Office of the State Superintendent for Education or Deputy Mayor for Education. For DCPS, we would be backfilling, if we needed to, local funds after some of their federal funds are expiring, but you don't see that necessarily in the DCPS budget like you do in other agencies.
Okay. And then my second and last, and if you could help me, if you would have your staff or you work with us so we can trace this through and understand it as well as possible. This may go to the CFO and may go to others, but as I understand it, our reserve funds tend to be 60 days. And I'm wondering, first, is that correct? Or does the length of time vary? And then I'm curious, what are the range of practices in terms of cash on hand for reserve funds?
So our policy is to have a 60-day reserve of emergency resources. Let's segregate that. I think that's what you're describing.
Okay, great.
60 days is a common best practice. Some jurisdictions will have longer or larger amounts of reserve depending on either capital operating issues. For example, they may have longer periods of time in between when they collect revenue, when they need to spend, or they may have experienced larger emergency needs. And so they'll need more money on hand based on experience. So for example, if you're an entity that has severe flooding every couple, 3 years, I've seen jurisdictions deal with much larger reserves to deal with that kind of uncertainty that is a little more predictable, but yet far outside of normal budgeting practices. In general, 60 days is a best practice, and I'm very pleased that the district has maintained that.
And if I could just add on top of that, I think at this hearing 2 years ago, and there was a discussion about appropriate reserve levels over many ACFR hearings, but 2 years ago, which was my first hearing like this in the role that I'm in now, we had nothing in the contingency reserve. We had used all fiscal stabilization to respond to the decline in revenues. The cash flow reserve was, I think, half depleted for making sure we can maintain cash flow. And we only had the emergency reserve remaining, which if it were not for the federal aid that we received early in the pandemic, we would have certainly gone through that to be able to sustain basic operations. So they have been utilized recently.
So you're saying they were spent down at the front end of the pandemic, and then as the federal dollars came, we were able to be in a position to replenish them. Is that?
Were vital in getting us through some of the financially most difficult months that we had in the pandemic.
All right, really appreciate that.
Sorry, just to add to that, just on the significance of that, there's almost $1 billion we've submitted to FEMA for public assistance reimbursements on our COVID-19 expenditures. Because of our reserves, we've been able to front the costs without having to dip into agency budgets while we wait for those reimbursements. Had we not had those reserves, we would have had to make cuts or hold off on funds until we receive those reimbursements.
And that's dollars that could district coffers that could be used sort of extending the period of federal assistance. Is that?
Yes, what it does is it helps us be able to continue to sustain those operations and then be able to recoup the costs and replenish the reserve to use again for the next cycle. And then we don't have to cut agency budgets.
And what is, I actually was involved in this again, when I was on the board of the Lisner Home, we were applying for FEMA reimbursement money, and it was arduous. I was not on the front line of it. You had to provide all different kinds of information, but I always got the sense that soon we might get, and we weren't going to get $1 billion, but that soon we might get whatever this money is. But what's your hope expectation for when that $1 billion might be delivered?
So we've already recouped about $760 million. And what it really does is it really goes back and replenishes the contingency cash reserve that we've been using to front the costs. So we're basically able to borrow from the reserves, able to front the costs, get the reimbursement, replenish the reserves, but not have to cut into anybody's budget. Otherwise, we would be putting local dollars that are at agencies, funding agencies' programs and services. We'd have to be using those instead while we wait for the lengthy time for reimbursement.
So when you say 700, I think 747, is that on top of the billion that there's an application for, or is it that we've gotten 740 of the billion that has been applied for?
We've gotten 760 million. So all of the money that we recoup goes to repay the reserves that we tap. And if there's any additional money, it does go to the bottom line. It's not going to be in that magnitude though, because the majority of it goes back to replenish those reserves.
Okay. I didn't intend to use as much time as that, but then you added to the answer and raised more questions for me. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Pinto. I'll keep going. Councilmember Parker.
I have no questions at this time.
Thank you. Councilmember Henderson. Councilmember Henderson. Councilmember Allen.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate everybody still being here. I guess let me just spend a little bit of time, if I can, and Mr. City Administrator and Madam Assistant Deputy City Administrator, I'll probably focus my questions towards the two of you if I can on this one. Kind of picking up from where I left off my last round, which was just recognizing that we have significant federal funds coming in. Wanted to see if we can kind of talk a little bit about your plans about kind of what the CFO talked about how do we think about being able to use those funds expeditiously, but at the same time, making sure that we've got the type of accountability, transparency, and making sure that, you know, we're not facing clawbacks. We are thinking that through. One of the things that, you know, we have both funds that will come in through formula and then funds that will come in through grants that we apply. But I think we all want to be able to move expeditiously. Having come essentially off the heels of the last few years with ARPA funding, first question would just be, are there any particular kind of lessons learned from ARPA funding and the opportunity and the challenge that has come with that you kind of think about as you're thinking through how to apply this influx of federal dollars that are coming in?
Sure. So I will start with that. And then I think Director Reed can really go to some of the implications for the infrastructure funding. So I've met with each agency that got ARPA funds more than one occasion and methodically went through their stand up and spend rate for the ARPA money. And one lesson is that simply standing up new programs and getting things started always took a bit longer than what was anticipated. Part of that was just the program design for new programs is complex and they have to be thoughtful. Part of that, though, also goes to the speed with which we hire and contract services. For the ARPA money, I think there's probably a greater portion of that on looking at time to hire and fill position in a very tight labor market. We've had to change some practices for both outreach and process to let positions be classified more quickly, not have as many requirements for reclassification, and make much greater use of hiring fairs where people get offers on the spot. And that's an area that we just have to continue to evolve, improve, and look at whether that involves changes to regulation or statute to facilitate that. The second area that I think for the infrastructure work is going to be most notable is making sure that the procurement processes are adequate to be able to get money on the street that for its intended purpose. So we see the benefit and there's not any risk of any kind of clawback. So part of the infrastructure task force that we had, that Director Lee was deeply involved in, had a subcommittee that specifically looked at what adjustments that we would want to recommend for procurement. And I think for the infrastructure work, I do think that's going to be a really important topic we have to look at, which is how can we get that money out the door, and is the current processes that we have in place suitable to be able to handle the kind of infrastructure dollars that we're likely to get over the next few years.
And I would just add to what the city administrator said, what he touched on. I mean, building up our own internal infrastructure to be able to move the money and hire the people and get the program stood up is incredibly important. And it's not always something that I think people think necessarily about putting a lot of funding towards, although I'm glad the mayor did support us in doing that. The second piece, as it relates to the infrastructure bill specifically, because there's so many competitive grants, which wasn't really true under ARPA, we've stood up what's called a Bill Central team has a dedicated staff person that's led out of my office. And we meet with agencies once a month and we review every single notice of grant opportunity. We discuss whether or not we're going to apply for it. Then we review if we got it. If we did, great. If we didn't, why didn't we? So that we can apply again and hopefully get awarded. And we track this on a continued basis. So having some central oversight in the executive on how we are doing in terms of getting the money out the door, in terms of getting the program stood up, but also going after all the dollars available is something that's been really valuable.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that. And just in acronyms, did I hear you say a bill team, meaning BIL?
Bipartisan infrastructure legislation, yes, sorry.
Just to make sure, thanks. So one of the things I'd like to make sure we have some understanding around is what authority do the executive agencies need in order to spend formula funding that's coming in versus the competitive grant funding that's coming in? And in what ways do we see that reflected in the proposed budget that we then go through and put forward and then have budget authority and appropriations for, versus where you're going to need the council to help give you the authority to make sure that those dollars are able to go out? Could you talk a little bit more about how you the difference between the formula funding dollars that are coming in and the competitive grant dollars and the authority you need.
Sure. So for the formula funding, we should have the authority we need. Every year as we prepare the budget, we should be able to adjust what we think the federal budget authority is needed to be, so that when we submit the budget, we can spend. When it comes to competitive funding, though, we won't necessarily know whether or not we're going to get the awards. If we do, we would go through the grant establishment process that's in place that sends a submission to council for passive review. One of the things we will be talking to you all about as we look towards making sure we can implement these funds quickly is a provision that was similar to a couple summers ago when we were receiving lots and lots of COVID funding. And so we were able to both shrink the time for passive approval and also ensure that it extended over the council recess so that if we got money in the door, we weren't delayed. And we restricted it specifically to COVID-19 funding. That was extremely helpful. I think the other piece that we'll need to look at that the city administrator alluded to is when it comes to contracting. So we're going to have some significant procurements coming through and ones that will stretch over multiple years involving really big construction projects. We have a good, I think, process in place with our federal highway trust fund funding when it comes to DDOT and council review of those contracts. And what we're working on right now and would like to come to you all and talk to you about, is there a way that we can use some of the good practices in that policy and apply it to other just infrastructure funding so that we can, to your point, make sure that we get the dollars out the door quickly.
Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to follow up with you and have those conversations. And I think given the last couple of years, we have experience of being able to utilize tools like that. And as our good CFO will always keep a keen eye on making sure we've got that accountability and we don't find ourselves in a clawback situation. One, I guess this will be my last question as time runs out. So you talk about, you've got a team that kind of assesses the grant opportunities. Should you apply? What would you apply for? And like you said, if we didn't get one, why? You've got, obviously as the executive branch, you're going to be making a lot of decisions about which grants you apply for, how the agencies are going to be operating and where they go, and which priorities you want to move forward. I don't think the council sits on that BIL team. But from your perspective, how does the council help you shape which priorities, either grant opportunities or spending plans, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where retroactively, a contract is being sent down, a grant is being sent down, but the decision really has already been made. And the council is really in a position of either saying yes or saying no to something that's moving forward. I would obviously prefer it to be a much more collaborative approach where there's kind of shared priorities here about what it is we're trying to accomplish.
So a couple of thoughts on that. So I think as it relates to the formula funding, most of the formula funding that we're going to get is largely through the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy and Environment. For most of that funding, there are an already established set of projects that need to be pre-approved by the feds that those funds can be used for. And so I think part of what we can do is follow up with you so that you and your team can understand what that list is and how projects get added or not added to that list for consideration. When it comes to the competitive grant funding, I think there's sort of two buckets. I think one bucket is competitive grants that enhance work that's already underway, that already is sort of shared values of the mayor and the council. So electric school buses would be a good example of that. The second part of it has to do with, I think, major projects that we are really going for the planning funds for, and then will require a significant public input process before we decide how to move forward. A good example of that is the planning grant we applied for basically redoing 295, right? And rethinking how that corridor is imagined. We applied for planning money. If we get it, that will allow us to have that public conversation with both the council and the public on how to shape that. I think the other thing that we could do is also be able to provide a list of what projects are coming up for notice and how we're going to apply for them so that if there is some input that the council would like to give, we can take that into consideration.
Yeah. Okay. I know my time's up on this round. I think that's something we need to make sure we do. Obviously, it's a really amazing opportunity for the city and for the district. And so the more we can work in collaboration on that, the better. And I would love to follow up with you so we can walk through those projects you talked about. Obviously, with transportation and environment, those 3 agencies you listed will largely come through here. So look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Let me just check whether Councilmember Pinto or Parker or Henderson are still here. We move swiftly. Councilmember Parker, you did not ask a second round, correct?
That is correct.
Oh, and you had no questions.
I had no questions. Well, I
Okay.
had questions, but they were answered by others.
Okay. I do not see, thank you. I do not see Councilmember Pinto or Henderson. So we are going to wind down this hearing. In a sense, this hearing today on the ACFR is the beginning of our budget season. I say in a sense because actually some of the performance oversight hearings have already begun. I want to thank each of the representatives who testified today, Inspector General Lucas, Wayne McConnell, the Chief Financial Officer Glenn Lee, and the City Administrator Kevin Donahue. I should not overlook Jenny Reed, who knows more about this than the rest of us, and other staff who've helped all of us in this regard. I'm going to adjourn this hearing in about a second, but just say that anyone interested in the council schedule of hearings, go to the council's website and all the hearings are listed. So thank you all again. The time is 2:15 p.m. and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.